Hello and welcome back. This is Thersites the Historian, and tonight we're going to be taking a look at the second half of the group of officers from Shu Han. Last time we looked at some of the heavier hitters, some of the real founders of the Shu Han state, such as Liu Bei, Zhuge Liang, the sworn brothers Guan Yu and Zhang Fei. But tonight we're going to be looking at many of the men who came later and some of the guys who I guess go a little bit under the radar, although some of them, as we'll see, are pretty big figures. So just to give a bit of a preview, tonight we're going to be seeing Zhang Wei, Huang Zhang, Ma Chao, and a number of other guys who you probably heard of if you're familiar with the Three Kingdoms era, and then some guys you probably haven't heard of but who actually are pretty important and played a pretty big role in running Shu, such as the Prime Minister Zhang Wan and also his successor Fei Yi. These are also very important figures. So, what I'd like to do is do a little bit of background. Somebody pointed out something that I didn't really touch on much, and that is that a lot of the relationships between people in the Three Kingdoms were a little bit hard to pin down. So somebody pointed out that the relationship between Yuan Shu and Sun Jian and then his son Sun Ce was pretty complex. But overall, Yuan Shu was the overlord and Sun Jian was just a general. And Liu Bei kind of had that going on too when he was a guest general for Yuan Shao, Cao Cao, then Liu Biao. And then he came in as a guest general while also having possessions in Jing for Liu Zhang. So some of the relationships between these guys were a little bit hard to properly delineate, and that's because, I believe, everybody was still ostensibly a subject of the Han Emperor at Luoyang. So, in theory, these guys can't really be under a lord, but in practice they were. So that's partly why some of this complexity exists, is because the legal fiction was maintained until 220 that everyone served the Han Emperor. And, of course, Cao Pi would break that in 220 by declaring himself emperor, and then the next year Liu Bei would follow suit, and it was only, I think, in 229 when Sun Xuan of Wu finally gave up the fiction of working for the Han and said, actually, I am emperor here. So I think that might be where some of that complexity that some of you were talking about in the last video might stem from, in case you were curious about that issue. And just to revisit some resources we had, there's an old game called Legends of Cao Cao, and apparently there's been a sort of English patch for it, so I've never played this. I just discovered it earlier today, and this would be worth looking at. Also, in general, kongming.net is one of the best resources for anything Three Kingdoms related, and if you're interested in this topic at all, I suggest checking the site out. One thing to note, though, is this site does crash a lot, and you'll notice that this is an older website, and it actually still has a lot of the behavioral norms of an older website. Now, it's been updated plenty of times since 2001, but still, it does tend to crash a lot. So any kind of traffic boost, and you're probably not going to be able to look up face portraits for an old Romance of the Three Kingdoms game. Also, somebody made a mod of The Legend of Cao Cao, and that's what I used for the thumbnail tonight. So Zhang Wei will be one of the major figures we'll look at. And I love this quote. I have no idea how this pertains exactly to Zhang Wei, but it's pretty great, so I decided to go with it. Though the night is dark and full of terrors, with the morning comes a familiar tune. And I think someone in the comment already said the tune of defeat. And by the end of this stream, you'll know exactly what the joke meant, because Zhang Wei, it turns out, doesn't have the best record. Okay. Let's look back at our list of people we've already covered. So Zhao Yun is our only S tier so far. Liu Bei is representing the A tier. And the B tier, we have figures such as Zhuge Liang, Guan Ping. Down here in C tier, we have the two sworn brothers, Zhang Fei and Guan Yu. We also have E tier Mi Fang. I couldn't quite rate him an F despite his treachery because he did some good stuff earlier. And then in the F tier, we have two fictional characters, Zhu Kong and Guan Suo. And we have Shi Ren, who only betrayed Shu and did nothing else as far as I know. And we also have Shamaki here. These other guys, I'm trying to remember who they are, and I'm blanking a bit, but you remember if you watched the last video. So refer back to that. Now you can look at the entirety of it, the Sleeping Dragon edition. Sleeping Dragon, of course, is the nickname of Zhuge Liang here. And also his courtesy name was Kong Ming. So that's why that website is called kongming.net. And all these guys had courtesy names that you have to be a personal friend to utilize. So for instance, Zhao Yun was known as Zai Long. That was his courtesy name. And there apparently were some actual fistfights over people using Liu Bei's courtesy name around Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, who'd get super offended by it. Okay, let's make sure everything is running. Hopefully we won't have the interruptions we had last time. Okay, looks like everything is working as it should. I disagree. Guan Yu deserves to be in the C tier. He really didn't do that much historically. Alright, so let's get back to the main action. I'm also going to pull up some maps to look at these a little bit. So, most of the guys we'll look at are later period today, so by the time that Shu Han is a kingdom in the 220s and onward. But not all of these guys are late period, I don't think. Actually, pretty much all of them are, now that I think about it. So when we're going to be looking at these late period maps, we pretty much covered all the early guys already. So here's a blown up version of the map. And you can see that Shu is the smallest of the three kingdoms. This is post the Battle of Fan Castle, where Guan Yu was betrayed and destroyed. And at one point, Liu Bei would have held a lot of Jing province, including this portion here, whereas Cao Cao was hanging on up here. Actually, this would be northern Jing with Zhang Yang. And the attack that Guan Yu led was up toward Zhang Yang, then he got cut off and destroyed, and then Wu took most of the land. And another side note somebody pointed out that I forgot to mention, that was a really good point, actually, and I might not have even thought of it at all, but the person said that part of the reason why Sun Quan was so willing to allow Liu Bei to rule over a lot of Jing is because Wu was deeply unpopular there. And that's because in the era of Liu Biao, who was the ruler here in the 190s, his Jing province was at war both with Yuan Shu, who was about right here at Shu Shun, and later he was at war with the offshoot of Yuan Shu, which would be Sun Jian and Sun Ce. And so that was a long-standing conflict between them, and a lot of orphans and widows in Jing province would know that the Sun family is responsible for them losing fathers, sons, and husbands. So that's probably why Wu allowed Liu Bei to hold on to all this for so long, and then later only betrayed him and took it after some of that bad blood had some time to die down. Okay, so without any further ado, let's slide down and look at our remaining slate of officers. And we do have some pretty big names here. One of them is notorious. I would say he's less famous and more infamous, and that would be none other than Ma Su. So just by way of question, I'm curious, how many of you have actually heard of Ma Su before? So if you can indicate that in the chat, I'd be grateful, because I'm genuinely curious. Because he's one of those guys who's rather important, but tends to be a bit ignored. And that's because he's famous for one battle, and didn't go super hot. So, Ma Su is the younger brother of someone we covered last time, Ma Liang. Ma Su entered service during Liu Bei's invasion of Yi province. This would make sense because Ma Liang himself wasn't that old. He was only in his mid-30s around that time, so Ma Su is a lot younger, but still not dramatically younger. So I guess they'd probably be the oldest and youngest son, respectively. As for Ma Su's physical presence, he was tall, he was outgoing, he was good-looking, and one of his skills was to make friends pretty easily. And his rise was really due to his friendship with Zhuge Liang. So Zhuge Liang and Ma Liang had been best friends. And then Ma Liang died rather suddenly when he was in his mid-30s. And so sort of my pet theory is that Zhuge Liang turned to Ma Su to fill that void. Because Zhuge Liang didn't really have that many close friends, and Ma Su and he had something in common in that they were mourning the loss of Ma Liang. So something that is a parallel to this, when we looked at World War I, remember how Hubert Goth was very much a beneficiary of Haig's favor, And a lot of that came from the fact that Haig had been good friends with Goff's older brother until he was killed. And then he turned to Hubert to be his friend. And so Hubert Goff got a lot of command opportunities that he frankly didn't deserve. So Hubert Goff was kind of like the Bronny James of his day. And Ma Su was the Bronny James of his day. So, Ma Su was able to connect pretty well with the Sleeping Dragon. The two of them became good friends, and they also had a lot in common. Both of them are intellectuals. They love having deep conversations long into the night. And their closeness was something that Liu Bei noted on his deathbed, supposedly. And he called Zhuge Liang over to him and he said, "Listen, I know you like Ma Su, but Ma Su is not nearly as capable as he seems. So keep him on a short leash. Don't try to use him for jobs that are beyond his capability." But Zhuge Liang, of course, who had just seen Liu Bei fight and lose a horrible battle at Yiling, thought that the old man's judgment had gone, so he didn't take any of this that seriously. Foreshadowing. In 225, Ma Su supposedly was responsible for the so-called Hearts and Minds campaign that Zhuge Liang mounted in the south against the Nanman. So, in one record, and I believe this is a historical record, not just a novel, Ma Su actually is the one who recommends doing the strategy. So, that would be a pretty good mark in his favor. It shows that he does have some overall strategic vision and that he understands things aside from formations and just the rudiments of war. So you would think, okay, this is a larger picture thinker. He has a future. And in many ways, he was already Zhuge Liang's assistant and kind of apprentice. And Zhuge Liang was now thinking of Ma Su as someone on par with himself. But really, he hadn't proven himself, because Zhuge Liang had won battles by now. He had actually held commands, whereas Ma Su had only been in the command tent talking. And there's a big difference between kind of knowing how things work and being familiar, and then actually doing it. So there are tiers to that. And Ma Su had not yet been the man. And so, his thinking, Zhuge Liang's thinking that is that Ma Su could be kind of like the new Fa Zheng, or Pang Tong, both of whom we'll cover in a little bit, and both of whom were dead by the mid-220s. So they could, potentially Ma Su could command when Zhuge Liang was absent, and so he was thinking of them as kind of a tag team. And this would allow him to project force in different directions. We also have to keep in mind, in fairness to Zhuge Liang, that a lot of the other generals he might lean upon were getting older. Zhao Yun was still alive, but he'd be dead within a year. And so, during the first northern expedition of 228, Zhuge Liang fatefully decided that the vanguard would go under Ma Su. And this is the vanguard of the main army, not the vanguard of a secondary force or a distraction. Actually, Zhao Yun was tasked with leading the distraction, whereas Ma Su got the lead of the main army. So, this is something that is questionable at best, and it's one of the reasons why Zhuge Liang is a B rather than something higher. Now, there were a number of people who could have led the vanguard instead. Wu Yi, Wei Yan, and a number of other people were available. They were older, more experienced, proven, and yet Ma Su got the nod. Ma Su also had a big disadvantage. His opponent was the veteran Wei commander, Zheng He. And Zheng He is someone who was pretty successful over a long period of time. And by this point, he's got at least 30 years of command experience under his belt. Ma Su will go on to make a crucial mistake. He was ordered specifically to avoid the high ground as a campsite. Because while the high ground conveys an advantage in battle, you have to make sure that you control access to that high ground for it to be useful. And Ma Su didn't do that. He camped on a summit near the town of Zheting. And he also not only couldn't access the base of the hill that he was on, but he also had no water supply up there. And so he ran into a bit of a feud with the second-in-command Wang Ping. And Wang Ping repeated Zhuge Liang's orders. And Ma Su effectively got frustrated and said, agree to disagree. Here's a small force. You guys can camp on the low ground if that suits you. I'm done with this conversation. Obviously, the master isn't here, but if he were, he would see that I'm right. because the disadvantages that he predicted for this area don't exist. And this is our first campaign north, so I'm making a call on the fly based on what I'm seeing around me. Well, turns out that Zhuge Liang was right about the territory, and also that Wang Ping was correct in his assessment as well. So, this army gets cut off. Ma Su's force is effectively butchered at the summit, except for some of them who are saved by Wang Ping, so some of them will make it back to friendly lines. But overall, the disaster at Jiting will upend the entire First Northern Campaign. So the secondary force had been bounced under Zhao Yun, not with serious casualties, but they were being pushed back, and now the main thrust had lost a lot of men. And so once Ma Su was recovered with his survivors, Zhuge Liang called off the campaign, and so ended the First Northern Campaign. I think it's safe to say that Ma Su single-handedly lost the whole campaign. So after surviving the battle, Zhuge Liang decided that punishments had to be doled out. And also, I forgot to mention, once he arrived on the scene with the main force, by this point, Zheng He had taken every major position, so there was no way to press the attack or try to retrieve things. So Zhuge Liang falls back, and he demotes everyone involved, including himself. But Ma Su and a couple of other officers under him are actually executed for incompetence. And he did this because he didn't want to show favoritism and didn't want to downplay the loss of so much life. Actually, a lot of people who weren't even that fond of Ma Su pushed back, and they said that Zhuge Liang was being too harsh. He was trying too hard to show that he's not playing favorites, and that Ma Su hadn't done anything worthy of the death sentence. But the Prime Minister pushed forward with this, and so Ma Su was executed. What's also interesting is that even outside powers, so a later Jin-era source, who would have sort of the Wei perspective since they're from the same area, said that selecting Ma Su was a huge mistake, but then executing him was also a mistake because he clearly did have talent. It was just not being used very well because he's put in over his head before he's ready. And I believe at the time of his death, he was also about 35 or so. Or no, excuse me, his brother died at 35. I believe Ma Su made it to maybe 38 or 39. So he ended up outliving his brother, but not by that much. So for me, Ma Su, because of the dramatic impact of the campaign that he led, has to be an F. I can see a case for E, though, because he clearly did have some talent, and he did give good advice at one point. And I actually agree that he should not have been put to death for the failure he had. It just wasn't that severe. He probably should have been demoted and then sent to a secondary front to train men or do supplies, and then he maybe could be redeployed later after he's had some time to rehabilitate himself. But at any rate, he was not as great as Zhuge Liang thought, and Liu Bei's warning, assuming that it was anywhere near real, which we can't know, of course, I guess he was right about that. Next up, we have another man with the surname Ma, but one who is not at all related to Ma Su or Ma Liang, and that is Ma Chao. Check to make sure everything's still good here. Yep. All right. So, Ma Chao was the grandson of someone named Ma Ping, who had governed Zhiliang back years before. Then he'd fallen into disgrace. He had gone to live among the Qiang and actually married a native woman. So the Qiang are just a native tribe in the northwest, kind of like the Huns a little bit. And then their son was named Ma Teng, or maybe it's Ma Tung. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but he is their son and the father of Ma Chao. And Ma Teng will go on to be a huge player in that region in Ma Chao's early life. So during the Yellow Turban period and beyond, Ma Teng was very much the man in Zhiliang. Now there were other power players there like Han Sui, but Ma Teng was probably the biggest of them all. He also got a formal appointment as General of the West in 192, although he had actually fought government forces back when Dong Zhuo was present. So Dong Zhuo had invaded Zhiliang on the premise that he was going after Yellow Turbans, but the Yellow Turban Rebellion was not present there. So Ma Teng had actually fought the government before. And so he's someone who also was kind of independent a little bit at least, at the beginning of this period. In general, Ma Teng was very much fearful of Cao Cao, and he had a bunch of charisma, so he was able to get rewarded after he surrendered to Huangfu Song, the Han general. Now, at one point around 200, Cao Cao invited Ma Chao to come to the capital to serve, but the young man declined because he had it made in Zhiliang, where he was more or less the heir apparent as the eldest son. He was also by this point a man at least in his 30s, so he was already settled in, had a family, all that, so he wasn't really looking to relocate and go on a bit of a career quest. Ma Teng would have minimal interactions with Cao Cao, but mostly go along with him after he took over the Central Plains, and mostly it was to keep Cao Cao's armies out of the west. So, if he just gave Cao Cao some tribute, followed some of his orders, sent a few people to court once in a while, that was enough to keep the animal at bay. Then, in 202, Cao Cao ordered the governor of Hanzhong, who at the time was a man named Zhang Yao, to attack 2 Western officers who were allies of Yuan Shao. And by this point, Yuan Shao has mostly been beaten, but not entirely. And Ma Teng sent Ma Chao in to help. That is, to help Cao Cao's forces. By this point, Ma Teng is pretty much too old to campaign. Ma Chao got wounded in the foot, but then he got patched up, went back in the saddle, kept fighting, and his comrade and subordinate Peng Di, who will later become a Wei general, was able to personally kill one of the 2 commanders. Now, Ma Teng will actually accept an invitation to the capital, along with some of his younger sons, and so Ma Chao will remain back with Ma Teng's army, and share authority with Han Sui, who's an old frenemy of Ma Teng. So the 2 of them had never been on good terms, but they had cooperated in the past. Well, now Ma Chao's really about to screw things up horribly, now that he's on his own. At first, he starts off on a good note. He tells Han Sui that he will regard him as another father, and that he's willing to put aside all the past quarrels that Han Sui had with his dad, and they will start afresh as friends and work together as colleagues. So that's a good start. And then they decided that they had to do something about Cao Cao. In fiction, Ma Chao's family was executed already, but in history, Ma Chao's father and brothers were still alive and well at Cao Cao's court. But Ma Chao will now march on Tong Gate, which is the sort of the path that leads to, I believe, Chang'an. Either that or it's past Chang'an and it leads to Luoyang itself. I can't recall right offhand. Either way, though, in September of 211, they ride up there and try to challenge Cao Cao's army. Cao Cao went in person with 2 of his western generals, and then he met with them in person. And what he did was to play off their suspicions of each other. Ma Chao had a plan at one point to just use his physical prowess because he was still a beast, and he was just going to grab Cao Cao, put him in a headlock, and drag him away, take him hostage, make a bunch of demands, and get his way. But that doesn't happen because Cao Cao brings his bodyguard, Zhu Zu. After this initial attack was repulsed, so they make an attack on Tong Gate after negotiations fall through, Ma Chao will return and start attacking other stuff, including a number of small towns that are not protected by the gate. This led Han Sui to throw up his hands, abandon him, and then declare his allegiance to Cao Cao. At the imperial court, then in the city of Ye, which is north of Luoyang, so this had been Yuan Shao's capital at one point, the emperor, who is now a puppet of Cao Cao, will declare that Ma Chao is a traitor, and that his father and brothers must have been privy to the plot. So Ma Chao's decision to attack Cao Cao and then kill civilians in the area had pissed off Cao Cao enough that he decided to wipe out Ma Chao's family as retaliation. This also led the death of Ma Teng, that is, and the coming of a greater force from Wei, to many of Ma Chao's subordinates abandoning him as well. So not just Han Sui, but many other men decided they'd rather go back home and fight with Han Sui or join Cao Cao rather than following Ma Chao, who up to now had not achieved anything. But he still has a reasonably sized army, And because they're from the northwest, they are regarded highly for their horsemanship, and also they're considered a bit unreliable, so people fear them. And Ma Chao was able to make the best of that by negotiating with Zhang Lu, who by this time is a theocratic ruler who's taken over in Hanzhong. And he's basically governing Hanzhong as kind of like a commune of sorts. So Ma Chao will come in and be a general. And at one point, he wanted Ma Chao to marry one of his daughters. But that didn't end up happening. From his base in Hanzhong, Ma Chao became a raider who would attack his old homeland to try to get revenge. But ultimately, that doesn't really achieve anything except that men on both sides die, and it costs a lot of money for his sponsor, Zhang Lu. However, Liu Bei, at this point, was then besieging Liu Zhang at Chengdu. So this is 214. And he invites Ma Chao to join him because he could use a stronger cavalry arm. So Ma Chao comes south, joins Liu Bei, and this gives Liu Bei yet another bravo in his army. A guy who can lead charges and inspire men, a guy who's a fierce warrior. And also he's thinking that Ma Chao still has purchase up in Zhiliang. So if Ma Chao accompanies an invasion of the north, locals will rally to Liu Bei because Ma Chao and his family are considered to be kind of like local royalty in a way. Now, when Ma Chao's arrival was announced, this seems to be the straw that broke the camel's back for Liu Zhang. So he was still trying to hold out at this point, but once he heard that Ma Chao was riding in, he's like, okay, it's over, and I don't want to have to surrender to a bunch of savages. So he gave up, and now Liu Bei was the master of Yi province. Now, Ma Chao will quickly get himself involved in a controversy as soon as he arrives. So right after he joined up, an officer named Ping Yang approached him and said that if the two of them worked together, one on the outside and the other on the inside, they could overcome the empire. And it was kind of vaguely worded like that. And it could have just meant that maybe Ping Yang will run logistics and Ma Chao can lead troops, but Ma Chao thought that this was an invitation to treason. And so he reported it to Liu Bei, who shared that interpretation and had Ping Yang put to death. Ping Yang claimed to his dying breath that Ma Chao had misunderstood him, and that what he was talking about is that they should work together as a team to back up Liu Bei's efforts to take out Cao Cao. After this incident happened, Liu Bei will station Ma Chao on the border of the north and give him the title of Governor of Liang, with the hope, of course, that one day they would conquer Liang and that Ma Chao's name would open up doors there. In fiction, and before fiction, even in folklore, but not in history, Ma Chao was named to a group of generals called the Five Tiger Generals, including Guan Yu, Zhang Fei, Zhao Yun, and Huangzong. But of course, there were no five tigers. That was made up in folklore. The historian Chen Shu thought that Ma Chao's inclusion in that list was kind of a joke. So by his time, that kind of folklore had already emerged and was starting to be accepted as fact. And he said that Ma Chao was totally useless as a subordinate, he did no great deeds for Liu Bei, and he was totally lacking in character. In fact, by this point, Ma Chao was kind of regarded as the Lu Bu of the West. He was someone who had an amazing body of work in terms of his physical abilities. So he had physical ferocity and skill at arms, but at the same time he had no moral fiber whatsoever. And in fact, most people regarded him as totally heartless because his actions had led to the destruction of his family. And when I say destruction of his family, I'm not just talking about what Cao Cao did to his father and brothers. But when he left Liang to settle in Hanzhong for a while, he had to abandon a few different wives and children to do so. And then later on, when he left Hanzhong, he probably had taken another wife and left her behind too. So he left behind him a lot of wives and children, and it seems that most of them remarried, the wives that is, would remarry enemy officers, whereas the children seem to have been mostly killed in order that they wouldn't later betray Wei to Shu because of their father's identity. So he effectively got almost every male in his family killed. except for one we'll look at in a minute. And so, it appears, though, one anecdote that is, again, a little bit questionable, is that Ma Chao was close enough with Liu Bei, the two of them were buds, that Ma Chao was allowed to use Liu Bei's courtesy name, which was something that he did not grant to many people, especially because at this point he's already on the road to becoming emperor. So either they just had a really good personal rapport, or Liu Bei saw him as the key to opening up the north. It's not clear. But there's one anecdote, which has to be fictional, where Ma Chao called Liu Bei by that, and the next time he was in Liu Bei's presence, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei were there standing up with their weapons at the ready in case he called Liu Bei by his courtesy name again. But we know historically that they were both stationed in other places. So Zhang Fei had a governorship in Ba, and then, of course, Guan Yu was governing Jing. And there's no way they'd ride that far to correct a faux pas. Especially since we have another historical piece of evidence that Guan Yu wrote letters to ask what Ma Chao's like, and he wouldn't have written the letters if he had met him. But anyway, some of these stories are fun, even if they clearly are made up. Ma Chao ended up dying among that huge group of officers who died around 222. So remember, Guan Yu gets killed in 219, and then Zhang Fei dies in a mutiny, and a whole bunch of other guys died around the same time, just of old age or disease, and Ma Chao was one of them. And we don't know, but it's possible that he actually was present for the Battle of Yiling. So that might be why he died, is that he fought at Yiling and was killed in action. But I would say it's probably a little more likely that he just simply up and died before the campaign got started. And we also don't even know if he'd have been on it or whether he'd been stationed elsewhere. Most likely he'd have been kept in the north, because that was why they wanted him in the first place. What we can tell from the record is that in his 8 years in Shu, he really didn't do that much. So aside from becoming buddies with Liu Bei and getting a title for an area they didn't hold yet, he didn't do that much. We know that his last action before he died was to write to Liu Bei to beg that his title, because he had become a marquis by that point, would go to his surviving son, the one who had been born since he had resettled, and that his military office should go to his loyal cousin Ma Dai, because the one man in his family who had been with him the whole time and had followed him along every step of the path had been Ma Dai. And so Liu Bei granted that. As far as his nickname, Ma Chao the Magnificent, that comes from fiction. And it's just as fake as the story that Ma Chao was striking Tong Gate in revenge, whereas in reality he was doing so because he regarded himself as the ruler of Zhiliang now, and made that decision despite the fact that his brothers and his father were living in the capital and were effectively hostages. When it comes to Ma Chao, there's only one rating that's defensible, and that rating is an F. Ma Chao was pretty much useless. And the fact that he's a famous commander is a joke. I don't know how he became famous aside from having physical prowess he never did anything with, but he's kind of the definition of someone who's completely useless. You would be better off without him. There's no reason to recruit this man, and because the northern campaigns wouldn't be mounted until, 228, he had nothing to offer. And even at Hanzhong, I don't think he was really present in that campaign. At least he's not attested. So we know, for instance, Zhang Fei did some stuff. Huangzong did a lot of stuff. But what exactly did Ma Chao do? Nothing worthy of note, apparently. Alright, now that I've dropped a bomb on Ma Chao, let's see the reaction to that. I guess nobody gives a shit about Ma Chao the Magnificent. I guess that's good. So much the better. Alright. Next up, we have Ma Dai, who is Ma Chao's cousin, and that makes him a nephew of Ma Teng. So, as I mentioned earlier, he was with Ma Chao when he attacked Tong Gate. He then accompanied him to Zhonglu's Hanzhong, and then he made his way to Shu and joined up with his cousin. And presumably he served as kind of a subordinate during Ma Chao's time. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, on his deathbed, Ma Chao got Liu Bei to grant his military rank to Ma Dai. And so Ma Dai will now be one of the governors in the north and one of the kind of area commanders for Shu. Most likely, Liu Bei had a very high opinion of Ma Dai. Now let's get down to Ma Dai here. But part of the reason why Liu Bei would really value Ma Dai is because Ma Dai was the living embodiment of loyalty. So the same kind of loyalty that Liu Bei and his two brothers had was reflected in the relationship between Ma Chao and Ma Dai. So he gladly accepted Ma Dai as Ma Chao's replacement. Now, in fiction, we get a lot of Ma Dai in action as a subordinate of Zhuge Liang. And it's possible that he was in all these campaigns because he was certainly still alive during the time. But we simply don't know. We also know that he became the Marquis of Qinkang, and the Battle of Qinkang was fought in 229, so I think it's safe to speculate that not only did he fight in the battle, but that he did really well. Or perhaps, once that position was taken in 229, Ma Dai defended it successfully against a Wei counterattack. But again, we don't really know. What we can say, though, is he clearly did do some stuff that was helpful. We just don't know exactly what he did. Historically, we only start to hear about him again after Zhuge Liang's death. So effectively, there's a pause between him becoming Ma Chao's replacement in 222 and then 234. So for 12 years, we basically have nothing, except what I've speculated about Qinkang. And during the aftermath of Zhuge Liang's death, there was a fight for leadership between one of Zhuge Liang's staff officers named Yang Yi and the famous general Wei Yan. Ma Dai sided with Yang Yi and personally helped to kill Wei Yan. So it was his troops who ended up doing the deed on Wei Yan. In fiction, of course, where everything is a little bit more personal, Ma Dai killed Wei Yan by stabbing him in the back personally. And he was acting under sealed orders that Zhuge Liang wrote for after he was dead. We also see a minor note in the biography of Sima Yi that claims that Ma Dai led an invasion of Wei in 235, which was turned back by the Wei general Niu Jin. And Ma Dai apparently lost 1,000 men, which is pretty light for an invasion. And if that's true, then it means that either the northern campaigns were bound to go on before that reverse, or it was a very minor operation or a kind of raid. Overall, it's hard to really say that much about Ma Dai and really to assess his abilities. He, I think, was superior to his cousin Ma Chao. He certainly didn't get himself into as many problems, and he does seem to have probably had at least a few good deeds. Also, because he's a member of the Ma family, he would also give that same legitimacy to the Shu cause up in Zhiliang. And so, for those reasons, I think that he warrants a C. Ma Dai was a pretty good officer, even if he's not quite special. Next up, we have Meng Da. So he originally served under Liu Zhang, and we're about to see a few people who served under Liu Zhang. And he was one of those officers who gladly left to serve under the stronger Liu Bei in 214. Apparently, he had the same courtesy name as Liu Bei, and so as a courtesy, he changed his name. Or excuse me, he had the same courtesy name as Liu Bei's uncle, so he changed his own courtesy name to avoid offense. And I wish I knew a little bit more about Chinese naming customs to get a sense of why this kind of stuff matters so much. Because I can't imagine, say, someone going to work for King George III at their court, say, and then changing their personal name to avoid offending the king in some way. Because even, I don't think kings would usually take offense to someone having a name. Anyway. So, Meng Da in early 219 will conquer a place called Fangling, and then he will rendezvous with Liu Bei's stepson Liu Fang. We've talked about him before. And the two of them together will capture the area of Shenyang. So this was a pretty successful year for them. These are two relatively minor commanders, and yet they're adding an area to Shu. This also was on top of the victories that Liu Bei had won at Mount Dingjun, where he had managed to seize Hanzhong. And then, of course, Guan Yu was now active out in Jing, and on the cusp of, it seemed, winning a third great victory. So Meng Da and Liu Fang were effectively putting the cherry on top with their operation. Now, Guan Yu knows that he's going to need reinforcements, so apparently he sent word to them because they were closer than any other commanders with a significant army. But the pair of Meng Da and Liu Fang said, no, we still need to mop up around here, and we have not had enough time to pacify the area. In fiction, however, the story goes that the two men both had a grudge with Guan Yu. However, their stated reason of needing to mop up, I think, is totally valid. If you think about it, you don't just go in an area you didn't previously control, take it, and then get to withdraw all your troops. That just is not how things work. So, Meng Da and Liu Fang did nothing wrong by refusing Guan Yu's request. Meng Da said that they were going to get scapegoated for Fan Castle as soon as they received news, and they probably got news before Liu Bei did, since they were more to the east. And so he said, look, we need to get the hell out of here, because we're going to take the rap for this, even though it's not our fault. And so, even though he and Liu Fang were actually not on good terms, he said, look, as the adopted son of Liu Bei, you're going to take the fall for this, especially because Liu Bei now has a healthy biological son and heir. So you're expendable now, and Liu Bei will blame you for the loss of Jing and Guan Yu. But Liu Feng decided to stay loyal. Meng Da, however, decided not to take his chances. And so what he did is he left for Wei, and he persuaded 4,000 of his men to follow him. He also took away some of the territory he had won. So there was a bit of a territorial changeover, and I believe he was then recognized in his area. Now, perhaps because the two of them had previous beef, of course, Liu Feng will ignore this advice, go to Chengdu, and then be asked to commit suicide. When Meng Da arrived in Wei, there were some misgivings, including by one of the senior Wei advisors named Liu Yi. And yet, despite that, Meng Da became the governor of Wei's southwestern frontier. So that area he had conquered now went over to Wei. So in many ways, Meng Da defected from home, if you will, because he took the area he had just conquered and then declared its allegiance to Cao Cao instead. Or by now, I guess it would be Cao Pi, since we're now in 220. In terms of his position, he was able to form a strong relationship with the Wei officers Huan Ji and Zhao Shang, and he also enjoyed Cao Pi's confidence. Both Cao Pi and Zhuge Liang on the other side recognized that Meng Da was talented, but then when Cao Pi died, his son Cao Rui took over, and he didn't really have any kind of relationship with Meng Da. He just forgot about him. This is also around the same time that Meng Da's two friends died, so Huang Ji and Zhao Shang. So now he's kind of socially isolated. He no longer has any ties to the power structure in Wei. So what he decides to do is reach back out to Shu. Or I should say, Zhuge Liang reached out to him. And so he put out some feelers. Meng Da said, I'm willing to come back and take this area with me. But unfortunately for Meng Da and Zhuge Liang, the new Wei commander in the west, Sima Yi, foresaw that. And so he invaded Meng Da's area and foiled the so-called Jincheng rebellion before it really got going. Meng Da was defeated heavily, and in 228, he was crushed. And to combine the speed of Sima Yi's arrival, so Sima Yi's arrival was a problem, but also the other problem was that Meng Da was betrayed by his nephew and one of his subordinates, who wanted to remain with Wei. So, if we're judging him just based on his early service to Shu, he obviously gained that area. and he was showing some ability. But, and then if we think about him in 228, when he's defecting, he was performing a major duty as well. So he would have been offering a territory for free. All Shu had to do was march in and claim it. So that would have been a boon had he actually managed to successfully defect the second time. But of course, he did fail here. In terms of why he defected, I don't consider him to be as bad of a traitor as, say, Shi Ren. Because he knew how Liu Bei would react, and he acted accordingly. So he decided to save himself. Which, while it might not be honorable, it's understandable. He hadn't done anything wrong. But he knew that because he had played an indirect and really almost involuntary role in Guan Yu's death, that he was definitely going down for it. So he decided to hedge his bets. Apparently another fault that he had, though, is not just that he was twice a betrayer, but also that he was a rather difficult man to get along with, and that he had a lot more enemies than he had friends. We already mentioned how he and Liu Fang were not really on the best of terms, even though apparently they could function together. Overall, I think that Meng Da warrants a C. C. I'll give him a C. He clearly had ability, but he also had some serious flaws, so he's a lot like Guan Yu and Zhang Fei in that regard. But I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about demoting him. What do you guys think? Where does Meng Da belong? Should Meng Da be a B, a C, a D, or what? He's a hard one to judge, I think. So I'll come back here in a second and see what you guys think about Meng Da. In the meantime, let's talk about our next officer. And some of you have heard of him, I'm sure. That's Huang Zhang. So we don't know that much about him, really. And in all of the literature, historical and fictional, his main character trait is his age. So this is the one person that I can name who is more associated with old age than Joe Biden. Because Huang Zhang, his whole gimmick, as it were, is being old. That being said, he wasn't that old. He was only 7 years older or so than Liu Bei. And most likely, the reason why we think of him as old is because of when he appears in the story. So if you think about it, he's a southerner. He's from somewhere in Jing, possibly South Jing, and so he was uninvolved, most likely, in the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So he would have been probably, I think, 37 or so when the Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out, so he would have still been a man in his prime. He could have gone out and fought, but he just wasn't in the right area to do so. Then things shifted south around 208, and now you've got the fighting centering around Jing province. It also appears that he wasn't really that involved in the various battles between Liu Biao and Wu. So Huang Zhang was kind of an unknown quantity, and now he's approaching age 60. So he's just someone who's been training for war in a land at war, but probably thinking that he might retire before he gets a chance to actually fight anybody. Or perhaps he was active in the South and we just don't know about it. I'm sure based on the amount of talent that he had, he must have had some serious experience. It's just not clear exactly when or where he'd have gotten it. Anyhow, after Chibi, Huang Zhang decided to join Liu Bei. So he goes along with Liu Qi, the other son of Liu Biao, who brought his troops over. So Huang Zhang will now sign up. And this also means that he will join with his boss, Han Zhuan, who also joins Shu. In fiction, Huang Zhang is really mistreated by his boss, but historically that's not the case. Historically, they apparently agreed to surrender to Shu, and there wasn't really much drama. So, when Liu Bei decides to go west, one of the men he takes with him is Huang Zhang. And perhaps this is because Huang Zhang has been waiting for so long to see some action, and Liu Bei feels bad for him. So he brings him along, and by this time, Huang Zhang is already at least 60 years old, possibly as old as 65. And yet, he will quickly make a name for himself as a bold and capable general. And not only will he do really well, but he also will be known for fighting hand-to-hand. And this is incredible if you really think about it. So, most of the guys we've talked about died in their 50s. Huang Zhang has already outlived life expectancy, and yet he's now going to become famous. So he lived his whole life, and now the postscript is where he's going to become famous. And he's going to do so on horseback in the middle of battle. So this guy actually is pretty epic. His historical biography says that he was the first to charge into the enemy's ranks, and that he became very popular with all three of Liu Bei's invasion formations. So remember, Liu Bei had one under himself, he had one under Pang Tong, and he had the one under Huang Zhang. And all the men in each formation really loved Huang Zhang because he put himself in danger, and he always won. So he was very revered. Now, in terms of why he did so well, it's possible that as someone who was a native of southern Jing, perhaps he had traveled to Yi province before and knew the land well. It's also possible that he had commanded a lot and we're just not aware of it. But at any rate, he will do brilliantly in this campaign. And we also have to imagine that Liu Bei must have had a good reason for selecting him in preference to, say, Zhao Yun or Guan Yu or Zhang Fei. But at any rate, it appears that Huang Zhang was exactly the man for the job, because he does extremely well. And yet, this will not be his best performance. Because his next performance will come in strategic Hanzhong. So for 2 years, Shu was pushing hard to take Hanzhong, first from Zhang Lu, although Zhang Lu might have been deposed by now, so it's mostly against Cao Cao. And this will be a head-on struggle for a strategic location. So either it will open up the north to invasion from Shu, or will open Shu up to invasion from Wei. So this is a very high-stakes campaign, and the decisive moment will come in 219 at the Battle of Mount Dingjun. And the commander in the field will be Huang Zhang, and his opponent will be Cao Cao's cousin and one of his best generals, Zhahao Yuan. And at this time, Zhahao Yuan has a well-trained force, and he also has a long track record of winning battles. And he's especially noted for his ability to launch very quick attacks. Yet, despite on paper being very much outmatched, Huang Zhang realized that Zhahao Yuan and his men might be overconfident and they might be easy to goad. So he had the high ground and he mocked them, and they abandoned their own high ground to come to get him. And when they were exposed, he didn't charge downhill into them. Now in fiction, Huang Zhang thundered downhill and cut Zhahao Yuan in half. But historically, it was probably just done by the troops. But it is largely true the way that fiction portrays it, insofar as Zhahao Yuan went down early, and once he went down, his whole army broke, and the battle was completely one-sided. And this is one of the most decisive battles that Shu ever fought. So the Battle of Mount Dingjun would give them Hanzhong, and that was the key to their safety for the rest of Shu Han history. So this is an immense victory. Probably their greatest battlefield victory of all time. It also was enough to frighten Wu into attacking Guan Yu. So Wu had been a little bit antsy about Jing leading up to this, but now that they see Liu Bei winning this massive battle out west, they start to realize that Shu is in the ascendant and needs to be curbed. So this may have been very much a driver for Wu deciding to help out Wei and deal a death blow to the forces of Shu. So, what happens next? Well, apparently, because Huang Zhang was now so famous, Guan Yu got super jealous and started writing letters to ask Is he really as good as he seems? And Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang had to write letters to assuage his ego and say, he's a great general, but he's not as great as you are. Maybe he's as good as Zhang Fei, maybe he's as good as Ma Chao, but he's certainly not as good as you are. Anyway, both Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang regarded Huang Zhang as at least as good as the two brothers in private, and they made him the same rank. So in 219, things are looking really great. You've got a lot of proven loyal commanders, and their ranks just keep growing. And Huang Zhang, despite being old, is still good. He's still got it in every way imaginable. But unfortunately, 219 was a turning point. And we already know what happens in Jing, where Guan Yu's defeated. And then in the next 3 years, when Liu Bei is mounting his big revenge expedition and building it up, there are a number of really important people who drop dead. And one of the first to go was Huang Zhang, who dies in 220. And posthumously, he was named as a marquis. He had a young son named Huang Zhu, but he seems to have died very early, and apparently he was much, much younger, so he might have been even more of an adopted grandson than anything, but anyway, he will not really live to adulthood. I have to wonder, though, given that Huang Zhang was such a late bloomer, if Huang Zhu had lived and then had only started really being a factor when he was 60, that would have put him in a perfect position to be of age and in the field kicking ass right when Shu faced this existential crisis against the forces of Wei. So, had Huang Zhu lived, that would be an interesting kind of what if. Now, Chen Shu, the historian, said that Huang Zhang and Zhao Yun were the best generals of Shu. Both served with honor and distinction, and their careers were not tarnished by character flaws, which held back and crushed others like Guan Yu and Zhang Fei. And I'm inclined to agree. In fact, my ranking on paper here was an A, but now that I hear all this and say it again, I'm actually going to elevate Huang Zhang to the S tier. He was a fantastic commander, and he did a great deal to establish Shu Han and put them on a real strategic basis from which they could actually threaten for control. Now, next up we have someone who's often associated with him named Yan Yan, but first let's revisit the Ming Da issue. Okay, so nobody knows who he is. So I guess we'll just stick with the rank I gave him then. Alright. So Yan Yan, at least in the fictional tradition, is often associated with Huang Zhang, but historically, he had nothing whatsoever to do with Huang Zhang. He was, in fact, one of the more talented generals under Liu Zhang. So along with Fa Zhang, who was a strategist, and Zhang Ren, who was a field general, they were kind of the big three of Yi province back when Liu Zhang was in charge. At least in terms of people who were capable. Maybe not in terms of seniority. In 211, Yan Yan warned against inviting Liu Bei. He said that Liu Bei had a long track record of betrayal, which he did, and yet Liu Zhang wouldn't listen. And so Liu Bei was brought in ostensibly to fight Zhang Lu, but of course, he then quickly turned on his cousin. When Liu Bei did invade, Yan Yan, unlike many of his fellow officers, decided to fight back. So many of these guys will simply hand over their forces to Shu and join up. Well, actually, they help create Shu by joining up with Liu Bei. But Yan Yan does the opposite. He's controlling the important city of Jiangzhou, which is one of the larger cities, and I believe it's to the southeast of Chengdu. So this is a necessary place for the forces under Liu Bei to take in order to capture Yi province. It's also possible that he actually was not in charge here, but rather was merely a second in command, or that he was only a military commander and that there was a senior administrator above him. We're not really sure exactly how the government was ordered here in the time of Liu Zhang. We do know that Yan Yan was there and that he did have some authority. The person he'll face will not be Huang Zhang, but Zhang Fei. So Zhang Fei will join the campaign a little later, and he will take the southward approach. And we know that Yan Yan put up a fairly plausible fight, and he behaved with a certain amount of competence. But ultimately, Zhang Fei beat him, despite his reputation, by strategy. So remember, Zhang Fei, while he has a reputation as kind of a brute, actually was pretty clever. And once he has Yan Yan defeated, Zhang Fei wanted to know indignantly, why did you fight me rather than surrendering? All the other guys are surrendering, so why did you have the temerity to fight? And he effectively said that the only generals he knew of were generals who submitted and generals who died. Yan Yan replied Liu Bei had entered an act of aggression, and that he was simply defending his lord. And then he said neither he nor any of his generals would meekly hop on the bandwagon. Now Zhang Fei really wanted his head, and Yan Yan, knowing that the man was angry, said, okay, go ahead and do it. I'm ready to die. And apparently that show of loyalty and respect for his lord in Chengdu was enough to impress Zhang Fei. So he set aside his anger, he spared Yan Yan, and then started to toast him. So Yan Yan was invited to dinner and treated like an honored guest. In terms of what happens to Yan Yan next, we really don't know. In fact, he doesn't actually appear in history again after 214, which suggests that he either played a really minor role, that he died soon thereafter, or maybe he actually didn't end up entering Liu Bei's service at all. So we have no idea what really happened to him. In fiction, he was as old as Huang Zhang, and he was there at Mount Dingjun, and he did some good stuff. Most likely the man had some moxie, but if the novelist is right about his age being advanced by this time, then there's a good chance that maybe age caught up with him before he's able to do anything. Because remember, there's about a 3-year gap between the conquest of Shu and the beginning of Liu Bei's push on Hanzhong. And while he was not a part of that big cluster of guys who died after 219, he might have just preceded them by dying before that. And so, because of this, we have to rank him low. Although he clearly had capability, had some moxie, some personality, and some guts, he never really did anything for Shu that we are aware of. So we'll put him in the E category. I can't put him in F out of respect because he clearly was not an idiot, and he also was not a coward. But Father Time defeated him, effectively, and he didn't really get a chance to contribute all that much. Next up, we have Fa Jing. Still good, yep. So Fa Jing was born in 176, so we know his actual date of birth, unlike a lot of these guys. He entered service for Liu Zhang in the late 190s, and he stayed around. Originally, however, he was from the northwest, so from Liang, the same area as guys like Ma Chao. And although he had been a lifelong adherent of Liu Zhang and had been there since his early 20s, he began to despair of Liu Zhang being too weak and incompetent to really achieve anything. And as the major warlords started to consolidate, Fa Jing was afraid that someone like Cao Cao would eventually unite the land and defeat his lord. And so he was one of the major drivers of the plot to have Liu Bei come in as a guest general, and then back effectively an invasion and a replacement scheme. So Fa Jing was one of the huge movers of this. And a guy who was probably a little bit more important in that early planning stage was actually a senior official named Zhang Song. But once everything went off, it would be Fa Jing who really kept things going. So, Zhang Song will actually get betrayed and killed by his own brother in early 213, and that's why Fa Jing will now become the main leader. Once Liu Bei has Liu Zhang cut off and isolated, Fa Jing will write a persuasive letter, asking Liu Zhang to surrender. And that will have some impact, although there are a number of factors that eventually broke Liu Zhang's will. His service in winning over Yi was obviously very valuable, and a number of places fell without a fight. So as we just mentioned with Yan Yan, actually fighting back against Liu Bei was not a given. And in probably half the areas where Liu Bei's forces invaded, they were simply received rather than resisted. Now, as you might imagine, Liu Bei rewarded Fa Jing richly and made him one of the major advisors. So Fa Jing, when Shu first starts, is really high-ranking in the government and has Liu Bei's ear. In fact, Fa Jing is also a personal friend and advisor, and he will successfully persuade Liu Bei to marry the widow of one of Liu Zhang's sons, named Lady Wu, who was the sister of another general out west named Wu Yi. And Wu Yi is a major player and one of the richer people around. So this is kind of a repeat of when Liu Bei married Mi Zhu's sister, because Mi Zhu and his brother Mi Fang were the really rich guys in Zhu province. So in many ways, this is a repeat of what he had already done. Most likely, Fa Jing sold this to Liu Bei as a way to create continuity with the previous regime, which actually had been pretty popular, and there were actually cases where the people of Yi rose up to fight for Liu Zhang, even when his generals weren't doing so. That being said, Fa Jing was pretty self-seeking, and he started to abuse his newfound power. He'd go after anyone who insulted him, much less anybody who was guilty of a real offense. Zhuge Liang was very displeased by this conduct, but he also knew that Fa Jing was simply too influential, and that Liu Bei loved him. In fact, I would argue that Fa Jing, from the year 214 to about 220, valued Fa Jing more than he valued Zhuge Liang. So Fa Jing was arguably the man. Now, Fa Jing is also a major driver of the Han-Zhang campaign. So together with Huang Quan, not a relative of Huang Zhang, they pushed hard for the invasion of Han-Zhang after Zhang Lu fell. They felt like there was a vacuum, and that Zhao Yuan and Zhang He wouldn't have enough men to resist a full invasion. So they felt like the time was ripe for this, and that then they would be able to either acquire Liang province and stand on the defense, or to drive forward into Chang'an and then into the core cities. And so Mount Dingjun, as we mentioned, was mostly a Huang Zhang operation, but Fa Jing was the one who gave critical advice. And not only did he give advice for the start of the campaign, but he also was the one who told Liu Bei to have Huang Zhang charge at that precise moment that was needed. So some of the credit for the victory also goes to Fa Jing, who had a sense of timing. And later, after the campaign, once Cao Cao arrived and saw the damage that had been done, he noted that the Shu forces had performed too well for this to be Liu Bei's generalship, because he was intimately aware of Liu Bei's shortcomings as a commander. And so he said that Liu Bei must have been getting some good advice from somebody, and that somebody in this case was Fa Jing. So, again, based on Liu Bei's performance a few years later when he doesn't have a Fa Jing around, one suggests that Cao Cao was correct, that Liu Bei was a shit general. No offense to Liu Bei. The conquest of Han-Zhang led Liu Bei to declare himself to be the king of Han-Zhang, and then to declare himself emperor in 221. However, Fa Jing wasn't there to see it, because in 220, he had rather suddenly died at the age of 45. And Liu Bei will mourn him deeply. So, Fa Jing is in this huge group of guys who are really important to Liu Bei, and who die between the murder of Guan Yu and the Battle of Yiling. So this is partly why Liu Bei did so terribly, is because a lot of the guys he was leaning on weren't there. And he also was emotionally wrecked, because almost everybody he cared about was dead, and had just died recently. Now, Liu Bei will grant posthumous honors to Fa Jing, and that's something he only did for a handful of people. So, for instance, in his own lifetime, he doesn't do that for Guan Yu. He doesn't do that for Zhang Fei, or Ma Chao, or Pang Tong. And in the case of Pang Tong actually died in 214, so there's plenty of time there. And yet, he only gives that treatment to Fa Jing, which suggests that Fa Jing was actually his favorite, and that now that Mi Zhu had died, Fa Jing might have been his best friend. Now, we have to remember that many of our sources are a kind of hagiographical account of Zhuge Liang. And so, because Zhuge Liang is set up as the great successor, he's always the main advisor of Liu Bei in most accounts, at least most fictional accounts. But I think it's pretty clear that Fa Jing was actually the advisor from the conquest of Shu until his death in 220. And that only after Fa Jing was gone did Liu Bei go back to Zhuge Liang. So if Fa Jing were still alive when Liu Bei died, there's a good chance that he would not have made Zhuge Liang prime minister, and that he would rather have gone with Fa Jing. Also, despite the fact that Zhuge Liang apparently was disgusted by Fa Jing's personal morality, he did say that Fa Jing was an intelligent and capable man, and he also thought that Fa Jing would have prevented Liu Bei from making the mistake of fighting at Yiling. So, in many ways, Zhuge Liang says that the battle happened precisely because Fa Jing wasn't there to stop it. And I find myself pretty impressed by Fa Jing. It's hard to really assess some of his impact because he was a little bit behind the scenes, and he also doesn't really get his head to run as an independent commander the way that, say, Zhuge Liang did. But I still think that Fa Jing warrants a solid A. He was clearly capable and made some pretty major contributions. And probably one of the reasons why Liu Bei liked him so well is because he too could be conniving. So he had, in many ways, been the architect of Liu Bei's betrayal of Liu Zhang and subsequent conquest. Alright. Next up we have Wang Ping. And Wang Ping has actually come up before. So Wang Ping, you will remember from when we talked about Ma Su. But Wang Ping is from the north, and he originally was orphaned and then raised by a family with the surname He. Or perhaps it's pronounced Ho, I'm not sure. I think it actually would be pronounced Ho, kind of like Ho Jin. But it's pronounced H-E, or spelled H-E. But rather than going with the name of his adopted family, he decided instead to stick with his birth name. He was not very wealthy, and so he entered the army at a young age, and this meant that he came in without a formal education. So he's one of the handful of guys who actually will work his way up from the ranks and become a general the hard way. Apparently, he always struggled to read, even in later years after he had taken the time to learn how to read. And his way of doing things was to have other people read to him. His favorite topic was history, and in his spare time he frequently had people around him reading out loud while he listened. And apparently he was an excellent listener, and he was quite knowledgeable about history. But perhaps because he was very insecure about his low birth and poor education, Wang Ping tended to be very earnest and serious-minded, to the point of sometimes making others uncomfortable, because he really couldn't let his hair down, as it were. He was someone who was always kind of on the job. So because of that, I don't get the impression that he had very many close friends, but yet he was well respected, and he was, I guess, if we can use the term, professional. He was also intelligent, and despite the fact that he was illiterate or semi-literate, he was also an excellent speaker who could be quite persuasive. So he actually did very well for himself in debates, even against people who had much, much more education. So he first came to fame in 228 during the First Northern Campaign, where, as we mentioned earlier, he was Ma Su's second-in-command. So Ma Su wanted to camp on the high ground, and Wang Ping resisted with vehemence. So Wang Ping was very dead set against this, and eventually he pissed Ma Su off enough that Ma Su actually let him take the troops and camp them somewhere else. Most likely, Ma Su talked down to him and condescended, and that might be why things got a little heated. Ma Su, of course, came from a wealthy family, was an intellectual, and so it would be easy for him to dismiss Wang Ping as an illiterate. That being said, Wang Ping ended up being the hero of the campaign. So Wang Ping used his small force to rescue some of Ma Su's men. And the way that he did this was to play drums in order to give the impression that his forces were much larger than they were, and that Zhuge Liang's main force had already arrived. So this led to Zheng He backing off and becoming more cautious, which then allowed Ma Su's survivors to cut their way out to safety. Remember I said earlier, Zhuge Liang actually punished everyone from the First Northern Campaign except for Wang Ping. Wang Ping was the toast of the town. He was the only guy to get promoted and to be celebrated. So he is the silver lining of the entire First Northern Campaign, because he was a star and did excellent things in it. And in many ways, although he will not be as personally close to Zhuge Liang as a number of other people, he will become in many ways Zhuge Liang's sword arm for the next several years. So during the Fourth Northern Campaign, he will actually defend the siege lines from an attempted assault effort by Zheng He, and he will win there. Then at the Battle of Wujiang Plains in the fall of 234, Zhuge Liang will die, and Wei Yan will make a bid for power. And the main person in his way was not Ma Dai, necessarily, even though Ma Dai played a role in his downfall, but Wang Ping. So what Wei Yan did is to put his forces on the path of retreat, so that way Shu forces couldn't fall back and they'd be forced to fight the battle to conclusion, despite Zhuge Liang's death due to illness. But while he was doing that, Wang Ping, who was outspoken and could be confrontational when needed, rode up to him and angrily demanded to know what the hell he was doing. And he explained to people that this was not something that Wei Yan was supposed to be doing. And so when the men heard Wang Ping speak this way, they began to desert, or at least to leave their posts and go back to their original positions. And so Wei Yan's attempt to hold the army hostage in this way failed utterly. In fiction, of course, Wang Ping and Ma Dai had sealed orders and then they executed them. But we also have to remember something. Wang Ping and Ma Dai were two of the senior commanders in the north at this time, and they also both survived Wujiang Plains. They also were war heroes, each in their own right. And so they got to write the official histories later and issue the official reports that went into them. So there's a pretty good chance that Wang Ping and Ma Dai simply murdered Wei Yan and then made up a story about why they had to do it. Or attributed the order to Zhuge Liang. We'll never know, but I suspect that what they did was rather self-serving because they knew that Wei Yan would have been the next man up, and we'll cover that in a minute. So after 234, Shu Han will become more defensive, and the new Prime Minister Jiang Wan will largely entrust the north to Wang Ping. So Wang Ping will actually command most of the forces on his own. This is especially true after Jiang Wan starts to get sick around 243. So especially for the next few years, Wang Ping will be the commander in the north, at least the most important commander on the northern frontier. In 244, there's a major invasion under Cao Shuang, and he will attack at Hanzhong. Wang Ping will be tasked with repulsing this invasion, and he will do so. He only had 30,000 men, but he resolved to stand, and this was against the advice of all of his staffers, but yet it proved to be correct. And part of what he did is that he put up extra campfires and extra fortifications, so that way the Wei army would think that his force was larger, and it fell back. Wang Ping was a very important commander, but of course in 248 he died, and then his title went to his son, but no one really replaced him. And another thing we don't know about Wang Ping, unfortunately, is where he stood on Zhang Wei's northern campaigns. So we don't know whether he participated in some of them, and we also don't know whether he supported the idea or not. But of course, his cooperation would have been nice, given how senior he was and how good he was. Overall, I think Wang Ping is a solid A. He's probably in the category of the best general you haven't heard of for this list. So he was certainly very skilled, He served for a fairly long time, and he did so with a great deal of success. Even if I do think he most likely killed Wei Yan for reasons that were not necessarily defensible. And speaking of Wei Yan, he's up next. And in my opinion, Wei Yan, who is often portrayed by Koei as a kind of barbarian, is in fact the greatest of the Shu generals, period. And I'll explain why that's the case. A lot of his significance as a strategist gets buried due to the desire in the histories to promote Zhuge Liang, and even in, of course, fiction, this desire is then amped up to 10. And so because Wei Yan is a well-known strategist in history, and then the romance drops that completely, I would say that Romance of the Three Kingdoms does Wei Yan dirtier than almost any other character, with the possible exception of Zhou Yu of Wu, who is made out to be just inferior to Zhuge Liang and also petty as all fuck. But Wei Yan is probably done even dirtier, for reasons we'll get into. Wei Yan was born somewhere near Luoyang, so he's from the Central Plains area, and apparently when he was young he relocated to southern Jing, and this is where he would join Liu Bei's army sometime between 209 and 211. So he joined up after Qi Bi. This puts him at being born in around 175, so he's already 35 or so by the time he joins up. And so there's a pretty good chance that he had some previous experience under Liu Biao. We don't really know, though. We also can kind of guess that he was a well-educated man because we know that he debated with people pretty constantly. He was rather contentious, and he was very well informed, apparently. But because he is so argumentative and seems to lack a lot of the kind of social niceties that we normally associate with some of these guys, there's a pretty good chance that he was more of an autodidact rather than someone who was formally educated. So he might be a little bit more like Wang Ping in that regard, although it's not entirely clear. Wei Yan served as an officer in Liu Bei's force during the invasion of Yi, and he was effectively Liu Bei's lieutenant. So he would have served in Liu Bei's force, commanded by Liu Bei personally, and then he would have been one of the major guys under him. So this is how he came to the first ruler's attention, and finally became a general at the campaign's conclusion. He also fought at Hanzhong, and when the locals requested that Zhang Fei be their governor in order to curry favor with Liu Bei by asking for a sworn brother, Liu Bei said that Wei Yan should be the man instead. So Liu Bei apparently trusted Wei Yan really well, and thought that Wei Yan was multi-talented, and was willing to entrust him with the most important position that Shu held. And Wei Yan, of course, would hold this position very successfully for the next 15 years. Wei Yan at one point promised that he would do an ancient strategy out of the I Ching, which effectively just sounds like defense in depth. When Liu Bei became emperor, Wei Yan was promoted to general who guards the north, and this title would be held by many of the more important generals who would come after. He was also tasked with holding the north after the focus shifted over to Jing province. So not only with Guan Yu's campaign, but with Liu Bei's revenge expedition, Wei Yan was left with a reduced force and told to hold down the fort in the meantime. Fortunately for him, he never had to really repulse any Wei attacks because they never materialized. When it comes to Zhuge Liang, the elevation of Zhuge Liang to Supreme Command would make things harder for Wei Yan, because at first they got along pretty well and they had been friends, but because Wei Yan is a fairly contentious guy, and because Zhuge Liang needs to get his way all the time, they started to fall out after they became sort of boss and subordinate. So that friendship kind of died out and became strained. So, despite the fact that they had this feud, though, and we'll talk about the details of the feud in a minute, so despite the fact that they personally fell out horribly, Wei Yan actually remained a vocal, major advocate of the northern campaigns. So many in Shu opposed them from the outset, but Wei Yan was not one of those guys. So not only was he on the campaigns, but he also was one of the major backers. And he would argue with anybody about the grand strategy. So they agreed on the broad strokes. When it came to details, though, they were always at odds. In fact, in the planning session for the first Northern Campaign, this is where their relationship started to really fall apart. So Wei Yan's idea was that they should march separately and then unite around Tong Pass, and this would allow them to have a better logistical setup going in. But Zhuge Liang said that's too risky. Wei Yan apparently took this as a personal insult, got very offended, and then said that his talents were being wasted and that his commanding officer was a coward. And it looks like they just kind of moved on from this, but that tension continued to fester. And both of them had a pretty cordial dislike of the other, yet they would continue to work together, and Wei Yan, despite the personal problems, would be the most effective general under Zhuge Liang's overall command. In later years, a number of Shu officials said that Wei Yan's plan was actually better, and would have worked better. Now, Zhuge Liang by this point was suspicious and would remain that way, despite the fact that Wei Yan would win a number of battles for him. It's interesting because a lot of this tension has made its way in the fiction, as we already talked about the sort of Byzantine politics after Wuzhang Plains, but there also is an earlier version of the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms where Zhuge Liang actually tries to kill Wei Yan early. So even before Zhuge Liang's on his deathbed, he apparently at one point tried to pull off a fire attack that would both engulf Sima Yi and Wei Yan's vanguard, and hopefully kill both. Now, that was taken out because obviously that goes too far, and it violates the cardinal rule of making Zhuge Liang look like an asshole. So you can't do that, and so the novelist took it out. Anyway, during the Fourth Northern Campaign, Wei Yan would be there, and he would be the star of perhaps Zhuge Liang's greatest victory, the Battle of Mount Qi, over Sima Yi. And this led to the Shu government as a whole showering him with praise and honors, and apparently that probably pissed off Zhuge Liang since he was the overall commander. And also, this battle was a really impressive field battle that enhanced the reputation of Zhuge Liang, and even more so of Wei Yan. It didn't lead to any gains. So they defeated an army under Sima Yi, but Sima Yi was able to prevent any territorial losses. At Wuzhang Plains, Wei Yan was the vanguard commander. So most of the actual fighting that occurred here happened under Wei Yan's watch. Chen Shu, the historian, believes that once Wei Yan learned of Zhuge Liang's illness, he thought that his rivals would simply allow him to become commander-in-chief after Zhuge Liang passed away. But that's not how things worked. And so, even though Wei Yan by this point had been proven to be the best general, and had won a number of victories on his own, or in a subordinate role, a lot of people didn't like him. And one of the people who disliked him was named Yang Yi. And he's not really a big deal in his own right, but he was Zhuge Liang's secretary at the time. And the two of them had a bitter rivalry. And Zhuge Liang, in his last days when he was dying, refused to intervene or address the problem, so it kept getting worse. And so, after Zhuge Liang's death, Yang Yi not only had been more in favor of Zhuge Liang, but also had a better relationship with the government back in Chengdu. So when he would write reports back home, he was taken more seriously than Wei Yan. And then, of course, as we mentioned, Wei Yan made his bid for power. And it appears that this was not a coup. What it was instead is that he wanted to show strong leadership in front of the army. And so he took his men and put them on the road blocking the path back home. And he said, "We must fight and win here. This is necessary. I'm going to force the issue." But then, of course, Wang Ping rode up and chewed him out and made a fool of him in front of the men. And so his men left their positions because they thought they were taking part in a coup. And this undermined Wei Yan's authority completely. And so Wei Yan then kind of fled and got murdered. After his death, a number of people really embraced some of his ideas. So he was gone when the new Prime Minister Zhang Wan and General Wang Ping, who in many ways was his murderer, agreed that Wei Yan's defensive plans for Hanzhong were brilliant, and so they adopted those and basically just kept them as he had planned them. So they changed what they had currently and went with Wei Yan's ideas. And then that would lead to a victory for Wang Ping at the Battle of Jingxi, just following Wei Yan's earlier ideas. And those ideas were about a decade old by this point. So Wei Yan was very much ahead of his time and was an excellent planner as well as being an excellent field commander. He also did struggle to get along with people. So much like a lot of these other guys, he was a difficult personality, but he was very popular with his troops. One modern scholar has actually suggested that Zhuge Liang's antipathy owed to the fact that he wanted to be succeeded by Zhang Wan, Fei Yi, and then Zhang Wei. And his fear was that Wei Yan, if he stepped into the line of succession, would then designate other people to be the heirs. But really, that should not have been a huge problem for those other three guys, because we have to remember that by the time Zhuge Liang dies at age 53, Wei Yan is actually older. Wei Yan's 58 or 59. And if we just think about the plausibility of lifespans during this time, Wei Yan's tenure in command would not have been a long one. He would have been in command for maybe 3 or 4 years at most. And that would not have been enough time to really set up his own line of succession. So Zhang Wan would have still been the next successor. And also we have to remember too, there's no indication that Wei Yan had any civilian experience or that he would have been prime minister. Just the commander-in-chief. And so, if this is indeed what happened, and if Wei Yan actually was just trying to put himself forward as commander-in-chief, I believe he was in the right, that he actually had earned the position, that he was the best general of this period for Shu, and that he would have been better than any other candidate. And as I mentioned, I believe that he is the greatest general that Shu Han produced. He's the only person who's successful at a high level over a long period of time. And he also shows both broad strategic powers and tactical ability. So he's someone who can do it all. And so for me, he is an S tier, and he is the best Shu general. Better than Zhao Yun, better than Huang Zhang, certainly better than Zhuge Liang, his rival. You could actually make a case probably for Huang Zhang over him just because of the importance of the victory he had. But personally, I'm basing it also on ability. And I think Wei Yan had the more consistent delivery. So I have to give him the overall edge here. All right. Now, our next commander is Liao Hua. His early life is shrouded in mystery, but it does seem like he entered service under Guan Yu before 219, and by the time that the famous Fan Castle campaign got underway, he was serving as a kind of secretary or chief of staff. His mother was already elderly in 219, so most likely the man was already in his 30s by the time this campaign happened. So he was not super young at the time, and he may have already been in service for a while. Unlike his lord, Guan Yu, who was killed, Liao Hua was captured, and then briefly taken into service in Wu. However, he yearned for his homeland of Shu Han, so he faked his death in the lead-up to the Yiling campaign, and since Wu officials were no longer monitoring his home because they assumed he was dead, he packed up his elderly mother, and they made their way west in disguise, and then he presented himself at Liu Bei's command tent, explained who he was, and Liu Bei received him and gave him office. He also managed to impress Zhuge Liang, who thought highly of him and gave him a command. And so, by 223, Liao Hua was starting to enter the sort of command cycle, after just being a fairly normal officer a few years before. So that escape and that show of loyalty played really well with Liu Bei and with Zhuge Liang. He was fierce and determined, he was fiery, And in many ways, you could say that Liao Hua was kind of like the avatar of Shu Han's fighting spirit. He's the embodiment of what they wanted to be in terms of ferocity. Most of what he would do is fairly late. So one of the battles he's famous for was fought in 238. And he here has an independent command facing off against the area commander for Wei, Guo Huai, and they would fight in Yang. Here, what happens is that the Wei forces would try to encircle him, but Liao Hua wasn't fooled. He foils the attempt and then wins an impressive victory, which ends up killing another Wei general named Wang Yun. He also took part in Zhang Wei's 3rd and 4th northern campaigns of 247 and 249, and we're not really sure if he's a willing participant or not. We do know, however, that later he was one of the leading critics of Zhang Wei's northern campaigns. And we're not sure whether that's because he had bad experiences during the 3rd and 4th, or simply because he had always felt that way, but Zhang Wei was keeping him on campaign to keep him from causing problems. By 262, when Zhang Wei will launch his 11th and final offensive, Liao Hua was openly calling him a fool, and he would even cite poems lamenting the fact that these futile offensives did not occur in the past, or that Zhang Wei didn't have the decency to wait for him to die before destroying the state in this way. The next year, of course, the state would be destroyed by Cao Wei. So the state would be overrun. By this point, though, Liao Hua was too old to fight. So he had been retired for at least a few years by this point. He didn't participate in any of the defenses, but he would still be captured. And because he was still an important senior figure, he was slated to be relocated to Luoyang, the imperial capital. But, like another senior officials we'll talk about in a minute, he was too old to make the journey, and so he died on the way. And along with 2 other people, he holds the distinction of being one of only 3 men that we can name who were in Shu at the beginning of the Shu Han kingdom and were also present for the end. And remember, Shu Han only lasts for like 40 years. But the only people we can actually name are officers. Obviously, there were plenty of other people, commoners, who would have seen this as well. We just don't know their names. But Liao Hua was a general. As for how to rank Liao Hua, he gave good service for a long period of time. And he had one distinctive battle that he did well in. So I'm inclined to rank him as an A. And also I believe he was correct about Zhang Wei's northern campaigns. So had it not been for that last piece of advice that he gave, and it was just the one victory that we know of, I might be more inclined to go with a B, but because he was also giving sound advice, albeit advice was being ignored, I will bump him up to an A. It's hard to talk for this long. Alright. Next up, we have Wu Yi. So Wu Yi, his father will die when he was young, but he has the good sense to be good friends with Liu Yan. So Wu Yi's father was friends with Liu Yan, who is the father of Liu Zhang, the man we talked about quite a bit today. And Liu Yan was a major player in the Han government in the late 180s. He then got assigned to govern Yi province in 188, and so Wu Yi's family went with him because they figured that there might be opportunities because they have this familial connection with the guy governing the area. When he came of age, Wu Yi saw his sister marry Liu Mao, and Liu Mao was one of Liu Yan's sons, so he is actually older than Liu Zhang, but Liu Zhang will end up being the successor. And I think earlier I mistakenly said that Liu Mao was Liu Zhang's son, but in fact he's his older brother, so I messed that up a little bit. So Liu Zhang becomes the successor, and that's probably because Liu Mao was struggling with his health. So Liu Mao was sickly and was certainly long dead by the time that Liu Bei invaded. And actually, Liu Yan had a number of sons who were older than Liu Zhang, but all of them died before Liu Yan died. So Liu Zhang, I believe, might have been the youngest son of the bunch and the only one who was healthy enough to live to see, like, 40. So Liu Zhang kind of won by default in that sense. Now, Wu Yi will remain loyal to Liu Zhang. So during the invasion, he is not privy to the plot to replace Liu Zhang, and that makes sense because they're brothers-in-law. And so Wu Yi will actually fight loyally and reasonably well during the defense. He won't have any standout moments or any dramatic moments like Yan Yan, but he still will resist. What really saves his skin and gives him a position, though, is when Fa Zhang will insist that Liu Bei marry his sister, who is the widow of Liu Mao. And so that will put Wu Yi back in a prominent position. And not only will that put him in a personal relationship with the new ruler, but also Liu Bei will decide to put Wu Yi to work. So Wu Yi will become a major governor on the northern frontier. So he will become one of the major frontier commanders in 221. In 230, in the northern campaigns, he also will assist Wei Yan, and the two will work together in an attack on a city called Nan'an. And this will earn him an official enfeoffment by Liu Shan. Wu Yi will also get promoted to protector of Hanzhong in 234 after Zhuge Liang's death and after Wei Yan is executed, so he kind of succeeds Wei Yan for a while. And he'll hold this office, which is probably the most important command post in Shu, aside from being commander-in-chief, of course, until he dies in 237. And it was around that time that Prime Minister Zhang Wan decided to fall back from that position personally, leaving it in the hands of subordinates, and to relocate himself to an area deeper in the interior. So Zhang Wan, only after the death of Wu Yi, decides to do a more defensive posture. And it's possible that Wu Yi, therefore, was either an advocate for defense or of renewing the northern campaigns. So there's a pretty good chance that Wu Yi had a lot of political pull and was using that. But in the event, we don't really know. And my guess is most likely that he was merely a strong supporter of the northern campaigns rather than someone who was seen as truly indispensable. Overall, I would rank Wu Yi as a C. He did pretty decent work, but nothing particularly stands out. Next up we have Wu Ban, who is a younger kinsman of Wu Yi, probably a cousin of some kind. And he almost certainly used his connections with Wu Yi to enter Liu Bei's service. So it's possible that he too had served under Liu Zhang, or perhaps he merely was just younger and this was his first job ever. Wu Ban would serve in the Yiling campaign in 222, and his orders were to camp on flat ground to draw the Wu forces into a gorge that Liu Bei was occupying with his main force. The ploy, however, failed, and I believe that this ploy is what is often portrayed in fiction as Zhuge Liang's Stone Sentinel Maze. That sort of weird trap that he sets up for the Wu army. That doesn't really work. Apparently it was actually Liu Bei, and it wasn't a stone sentinel maze, it was merely just a gorge. A very rough area. So after that fails, Shu will be routed from Jing province with heavy losses. By 231, Wu Ban will now be in a more senior rank. He'll also fight at Mount Qi, which was Zhuge Liang's greatest victory in the Fourth Northern Campaign. As we mentioned, this was also a notable moment for Wei Yan. That being said, this victory ultimately was more of a tactical victory. Interestingly enough, though, but not surprisingly, a Jin-era source will say it's a victory for Sima Yi. And in case you weren't aware, Sima Yi's family will become the Jin dynasty. So his sons will found it. So it's unsurprising that they're trying to really burnish the reputation of granddad. The victory ended up not being important in the end because of logistical issues. And we'll cover those more when we talk about Li Yan. In 237, once Wu Yi dies, Wu Ban inherits his offices. and honors, and then he will not live that much longer, though. So he will then live to either 239 or 243, and the reason we think those are his probable dates of deaths is because his various offices and honors are then reassigned to other people in those two dates. So there's a good chance that he was stripped of one and then died a few years later. Anyway, when it comes to Wu Ban, he didn't really do that much. So he is a little bit difficult to gauge. So because of that, he seems to me to be a bit below average, and I'll give him a D. Alright, let's check to make sure the stream is still running, because you just never know with the internet the way it is around here. Everything's still good. And yes, I have played Kessen 2. Will I do a Gen Officer series? Probably not, but maybe. Next up on our list is Li Yan. So he's a native son of Jing Province. He served under Liu Biao. He rose in rank quickly. He served as prefect in a few different cities under Liu Biao's direction. And for want of a better description, he seems to have been kind of an expert on city-level administration. He got booted from his position by the Wei invasion. He then entered Liu Zhang's service and became prefect of Chengdu. He will try his best to defend the city of Mianji, but he will be defeated, his men surrender, and then he enters Liu Bei's service. And Liu Bei will now send him to a different city. And despite the fact that Liu Bei doesn't really take to him, and he won't become a friend of him, Li Yan will still get appointed to a committee of 5 to formulate the law code for Shu. So he's still considered a wise man with a skill set that's a little different than other people. And so he will play a pretty big role in setting the norms and practices of Shu Han. It appears, however, that one of his major contributions was to oversee a number of major civil engineering projects. So he's kind of like a Harry Hopkins of Shu. That being said, much like Harry Hopkins, he was not easy to get along with. And at least 2 of his subordinates resigned from office. And one of them actually not only resigned, but moved north and joined Wei. So that's how hard of a taskmaster Li Yan was. In 221 and 222, while Liu Bei is planning his revenge expedition in Jing, there's a major bandit disturbance, and Li Yan will be the guy who goes out to deal with it. So not only will he deal with one, but he'll deal with both. And he didn't need reinforcements to do it. So Liu Bei didn't have to slow down his war preparation, and Li Yan was able to deal with this. And so that will really impress people. They will start to think of him as a military figure for the first time, and his standing within the overall hierarchy will be very much enhanced. He also has authority over the major centers at Jiangzhou and Yong'an, and these places both have troops and are strategically important. It appears, however, that Li Yan did not really understand the Shu hierarchy if it was formally laid out to him, or that our sources have perhaps overemphasized people like Zhuge Liang, and maybe we don't understand it and Li Yan did. Either way, he thinks that he is equal to Zhuge Liang, rather than his subordinate. And that's because of a bunch of promotions he received from Liu Bei shortly before he died. So Li Yan felt like he was at least equal to Zhuge Liang. But Zhuge Liang will still issue him orders. And in 230, Li Yan will really balk at Zhuge Liang ordering him to come north with 20,000 men to participate in one of the northern campaigns. And they started negotiating, and Li Yan agreed only to fight when Zhuge Liang said, "You can leave your son in charge of the area, so that way you'll be able to return easily." So that's what Li Yan did. Now he moves north with Zhuge Liang. They fight Xiao Zhen, and this will very much bring into light that rivalry that had been building, because Li Yan apparently had been bitching about his place in the hierarchy since Liu Bei's death. During the 4th Northern Campaign, Li Yan controls the logistics, and he was caught red-handed scheming. And the reason that what he did was to send contradictory reports and messages. So he was casting blame on Zhuge Liang and also giving Liu Shan the impression that the prime minister was doing things wrong. He also was sending false reports to Zhuge Liang about what Chengdu was doing. And so he was trying to sow mutual discontent, so that way one or the other would blow up at the other, and then he would be the man they would entrust with the command next. And so the reason he got caught is that he left a paper trail, because he wrote letters to both, and Zhuge Liang asked to see the letters that he had sent and pointed this out. So he gets confronted by this, by Zhuge Liang on this. And what will really happen is that this happens after the campaign when this is revealed. Because Zhuge Liang is trying to figure out, why didn't I have the supplies I thought I would have? Because he does win a victory at Mount Qi that we've talked about in 231. But then because he doesn't have the logistical legs, he can't press on to try to take a city beyond that because he's out of supply. So during the investigation, he finds the letters, he confronts Li Yan, and then he's going to strip him of all offices, or at least Liu Shan, the emperor, will. So Li Yan stripped of all offices and dismissed. And Zhuge Liang effectively says that he was seeking power and that he is the Sima Yi of Shu Han. Because Sima Yi famously will betray Wei. Spoilers. Now, for the next 3 years of his life, Zhuge Liang will continue to treat Li Yan's son well, and as if nothing had ever happened, so Li Yan's son will continue on as governor in his father's stead. And when he dies, rather than saying, "Okay, Li Yan, you can come back now," he instead writes a letter to Li Yan's son and says, "I think you're a fine young man, and I believe that you will restore your family's honor." So Zhuge Liang's dead now. No reinstatement came, no reconciliation occurred, and so Li Yan now fell into a deep depression, and he would die soon thereafter. Li Yan is clearly a capable man, someone who had a lot of energy, a lot of ambition, but ultimately he was not willing to be a subordinate. And I can kind of understand why, given how Zhuge Liang always tried to micromanage everything and didn't really give people the freedom they needed to succeed. So I can understand why he might not have wanted to work with him. Shu might have been better off had they reinstated Li Yan at some point and given him a second chance, maybe a more minor role, because he clearly had the ability to contribute. That being said, because of the way that he compromised the Fourth Northern Campaign, which actually had some legs to it, he took those legs away by hamstringing it, I guess you could say, I can only give him a C. I think a C is actually being a little bit generous, because I think in terms of ability, he's a solid B. But if we think about how he, for his own personal gain, completely fucked up a campaign and tried to sow discontent between the government and their general, that's a pretty big error. And so we have to count that against him. Alright, next up we have Huang Quan. So Huang Quan was a longtime retainer of Liu Zhang. He is not related to Huang Zhang. And he also was among those who opposed inviting Liu Bei because he predicted what would happen. And he also knew that Liu Bei was deeply ambitious. So when the war broke out, Huang Quan would fortify his command area, and he actually held out until after he learned that Liu Zhang had capitulated. And Liu Bei will then be impressed by this. He'll say that Huang Quan was not only loyal but competent, and so he will pursue him and hire him. In 215, Huang Quan will persuade Liu Bei to make peace with Wu. So this is after Wu had taken some of the territory back. And then Guan Yu, of course, was eager to go and attack it. But Huang Quan persuaded Liu Bei to let that go and to focus instead on Han Zhang. Now, this was at a time, of course, when Cao Cao had just conquered Zhonglu, and so there was still some instability and some opportunities in Hanzhong, which is again the most strategic area. And so this seems to have been a pretty important, correct decision that Liu Bei made with Huang Quan's backing. That being said, Jing province was left in a parlous state, as Guan Yu was still angry with Wu because they had taken some stuff from him, and Wu still wanted the rest. And then also Guan Yu was willing to strike at Wei, assuming that Wu wouldn't aggress him any further. So it left Guan Yu in a pretty bad spot. Nonetheless, it would work out because they did seize Hanzhong. And a lot of this happens because Huang Quan will go to Zhang Lu and persuade him to surrender to Liu Bei. Or at least try to. But instead, Zhang Lu will opt to surrender to Cao Cao at the last minute. So Cao Cao will offer a better surrender agreement. Then Huang Quan will lead a force forward and defeat 3 of Cao Cao's generals and then grab some minor commanderies in the area. According to the historian Qin Shu, although of course we know that Huang Zong and others would be the main victors at Mount Dingjun, apparently Huang Quan was the major planner of the whole campaign. So he's the guy who really laid out the blueprint for what they would do, and maybe did some of the legwork for logistics and things like that. Later on, Huang Quan would object to Liu Bei's battle plans for Yiling, and much like he did with everybody else, Liu Bei decided to sideline him. So he got relegated to guard duty up north. And unfortunately for Huang Quan, this meant that after the defeat of Liu Bei, his command area was actually geographically isolated, and it gets cut off from the rest of Shu. And Wu, of course, would capture the rest of Jing. Huang Quan was now cut off without any way to communicate with the West, and so the only people he could communicate with were Wei. So he actually is forced to surrender, and then he enters Cao Pi's service. And he will be honored in Wei. He'll have the respect of a number of important people, including Cao Pi, Sima Yi, and Cao Rui. But ultimately, he was getting older by this time, and he really wouldn't do that much as a Wei officer. It appears that he lived until the mid-240s. So as for this man, Huang Quan, I actually will rate him as an A. He seems to have been a very good officer. Unfortunately, his ending was not great, but that's not his fault. So Huang Quan is an A. And now these are going to start to go a little quicker because we have a few guys about whom we know not that much. Next up, we have Gao Jiang. So we don't really know where he was from, how old he was, or when he entered service. We first see him during the Hanzhong campaign. He worked alongside of Chen Shi later on, and he was defeated by Zhu Huang. During the first northern campaign in 228, Gao Jiang was a subordinate of Ma Su, and he retreated with his troops after Zheting became a disaster. He will not be executed for this. At Mount Qi in 231, he served alongside of Wei Yan and Wu Ban and helped to achieve that impressive victory. He also was infuriated at Li Yan, and he was the one who gave a second to the recommendation that Li Yan be drummed out of the service and stripped of all rank. In 233, he will be replaced as General of the Right. So what it looks like, though, is that not that he died, but rather that he retired. And the reason why we think that is because rather than having all his positions replaced at once, only his military positions were replaced in 233, whereas his civilian titles were not reassigned until 241. So most likely, that's when he died. And overall, I think it's safe to say this is not a lucky man, because he tended to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a few occasions when he was at the right place at the right time, other people took the spotlight. So overall, for Gao Jiang, I will rank him as a D. Next up, we have Chen Shi, also sometimes called Chen Ji with a J. His career is a lot like Gao Jiang's in that he appears suddenly in 217. He gets beaten by Shu Han, but then ultimately he sticks around and participates in the victory in Hanzhong. At the Battle of Yiling, he's put in charge of the fleet, and we can't really gauge his conduct because the whole Shu army collapses, so there wasn't anything that he could have done to change that one way or the other. His third and final appearance was during the Third Northern Campaign of 229, where he leads a secondary operation to capitalize on Zhuge Liang's victory at Jianwei. And here, Qin Shi will seize 2 commanderies. And Wei will then counterattack against him, and he'll hold down the fort until Zhuge Liang can come up and reinforce him, and this leads to these gains being preserved. Overall, Qin Shi is a little bit better than his colleague Gao Jiang, and so I will give him a C. But he also had some pretty rotten luck overall. Let's check. All right. And now we'll cover a man mired in controversy, and that is the second ruler, Liu Shan, who is Liu Bei's eldest biological son and successor. He's famous for being benevolent, and he's traditionally been viewed as a virtually useless ruler. Born in 207, he was famously rescued as a baby at Changban by Zhao Yun, and that is a deed that he never forgot. He would remain good friends with Zhao Yun for the rest of Zhao's life, and apparently he also had a warm regard for Zhao Yun's sons. If anything, Zhao Yun was kind of his personal hero. So he actually probably thought more highly of Zhao Yun than even the Dynasty Warriors franchise does, and they put Zhao Yun on the cover of every game, so that tells you a lot. So our knowledge of his reign and his contributions is pretty limited, and that's because Zhuge Liang, as head of government, did not assign many scribes to the imperial court. And so there are no records of what Liu Shan was up to. We don't know how he spent his days. Now, maybe the reason why Zhuge Liang didn't keep records there is because he either thought that nothing would happen that was important, or maybe he thought Liu Shan would embarrass himself, or maybe he just was trying to save money. But we're actually less informed about Liu Shan than we are about any Wei or Wu ruler. That being said, it is very possible that Liu Shan was more active and informed than we often believe. So a few modern scholars will point to, as evidence of him being on the ball, that there were no real coup attempts at court during the 40 years or so that he was on the throne. And so because coups were so common, this seems to point to the fact that he might have been semi-adroit at some level. We also have to remember, though, that he was well insulated by capable and cunning administrators. And so there is a kind of succession of people who are pretty capable who are protecting him. Nonetheless, the fact remains that he was able to maintain a peaceful position that wasn't really challenged for his entire life. And that is more of an accomplishment than it sounds like. Early on, Liu Bei seems to have had some serious reservations about his son's abilities. And he also famously told Zhuge Liang that he could replace him if needed, which most likely meant that he could put one of Liu Bei's other sons on the throne, but some people have chosen to interpret that as Zhuge Liang was authorized to just simply take command and become emperor himself. Liu Shan will wisely step aside and allow Zhuge Liang to govern until 234, and Liu Shan will also come to regard Zhuge Liang as a kind of surrogate father. After that, he will dutifully employ Zhang Wan and Fei Yi as prime ministers, just as Zhuge Liang recommended on his deathbed. So he will largely follow Zhuge Liang's plans. Liu Shan will actually end up marrying one of Zhang Fei's daughters, so she will become the empress and the mother of the would-be heirs to the dynasty. But then she died early, so she dies in 237, and upon her death, Liu Shan will marry her younger sister. So the only women that he ever was married to were both daughters of Zhang Fei. As for Zhang Wan, the prime minister, he'll govern until ill health brings him down around 243. Fei Yi will then get a strong start, including kind of running things before his friend Zhang Wan's death. But then things start to fall apart, and it appears that around the mid-240s, this is when Liu Shan is really starting to assert himself for real. And a lot of this is through the services of the eunuch Huang Hao. And supposedly, this will very much undermine the efficiency of the state. So from the mid-240s, Liu Shan will start to take a real role in domestic affairs, although apparently he did not really get that involved with foreign policy, leaving almost all of that to Fei Yi and Zhang Wei. Liu Shan will also become a fan of taking leisure trips to the countryside. So maybe this puts him in better touch with his people a bit and shows that he understands the need to be seen and to be active. So he doesn't want to become a palace prince like the late Han. So he does show some signs of life, some signs of having something happening between his ears. That being said, make no mistake about it, he is a weak ruler. When Fei Yi dies, there's no new regent, and effectively this is when Liu Shan becomes fully independent, even though by now he's got to be at least in his 30s, probably 40s. And so, but for the first time, he'll be governing in his own right, officially, without an official handler, or kind of like a regent figure. There's also a huge blow-up between Zhang Wei and Huang Hao over foreign policy, and each one will denounce the other very loudly, but Liu Shan will choose to not decide. So he will not side with his good friend and buddy Huang Hao. He also will not side with the most famous general who's still active, Zhang Wei. He'll instead just allow them to hate each other and keep going. So it's maybe better than executing someone useful, but still it shows that the man's in a weak position, and he also doesn't really opine about who's correct. So one option, rather than getting rid of one of them, would be to say that one of them is right and here's the new policy. But Liu Shan doesn't do any of that. He just pretends the problem isn't there and wants it to go away. Wu historians would visit Chengdu, and they reported that by the early 260s, the government was not being well run at all. And in fact, that a number of people were starving. So despite the idea that Shu Han was founded on benevolence and that it had these brilliant administrators, either Huang Hao had completely derailed things in a fairly short time, or perhaps things were never that great to begin with. But ultimately, a lot of the blame for that has to go to Liu Shan. So not only is he backing Zhang Wei's wasteful northern campaigns, but he's also not doing anything about the problems that exist. He's just allowing things to continue. Pretty much every contemporary source says that Liu Shan is at best mediocre, and most sources claim that he's probably worse than that. Liu Shan will embrace Zhang Wei's strategy in 263, and then when it fails, he'll throw in the towel. So, what I mean by this is that Zhang Wei will take up a station to hold off the commander Zhang Hui, and then when Deng Ai arrives closer to Chengdu, Liu Shan, rather than fighting on as Liu Zhang had done, decided instead to just give up early. And that has made him appear to be passionless and gutless in the eyes of many subsequent generations. That being said, it actually might have been a smart move. Maybe he was smart enough to realize that Deng Ai was going to win, that they were screwed, and that any further resistance would be a waste of life. And so Liu Shan will surrender. Overall, it doesn't help him that he's not charismatic. He's also not very emotional. And there are only a handful of instances where we have examples of him showing emotion. And one of them was back when Zhao Yun died in 229. And he wept very openly. He received news in 263 or 264 that one of his sons had died in that attempted revolt led by Zhang Wei and the Wei general Zhang Hui. And when he was informed that his son was dead, he apparently didn't really react. So he just kind of no-sold it. And maybe that was because he was at Luoyang and he was afraid of showing any kind of sympathy for a rebel. But at any rate, this man showed more interest in his own self-preservation in many cases than he did in the state he was running. And so that has led a lot of people to think that he's unfeeling and incompetent and just generally not worthy of his position. There was also another case in Luoyang where Sima Yi's son Sima Zhao decided to have some Shu songs play. So some songs that were associated with the state of Shu. And at this banquet, all the former Shu officials wept and appreciated the gesture. But Liu Shan didn't show any emotion at all. And when asked why he wasn't saddened by all this, he said that he was perfectly content with his new life. That he was perfectly content living in the splendor of Luoyang and going about his day and attending functions and not really doing much. And so in Chinese culture, he's kind of become a watchword for a lack of character. And this kind of behavior has become associated with lacking character. But a lot of modern scholars have been a little more favorable because they think that he had a sort of wisdom, that he knew he was merely a puppet, that he did impose at least a little bit of caution on Shu's offensives in the Zhang Wei, and that he also kept his prime ministers working only in concert with Wu and attacking when Wei was off balance. So Liu Shan apparently did veto offensives when Wei had its full focus available. So he did a few things, it appears. But again, we're working with some fairly limited evidence, and it's not entirely clear exactly what Liu Shan thought or wanted to do or even did. So, at the end of the day, I kind of have to look more at the contemporary assessments. That being said, I don't want to hold his lack of charisma and emotions against him too much, so I'm not going to put him in the F, but I will give him an E. He really didn't do much with what he had. That being said, he did some stuff, and like I said, he went without a coup for 40 years, which in itself is kind of an accomplishment, even if his government was not necessarily the best. But his instinct for self-preservation seems to have been pretty strong. Now, our next general is Dong He. Or Dong He. So he spent his early life in the north, but his roots were actually in Jiangsu, one of the major cities of Yi province. So that's where his grandparents have been from. He'll return to the area in 196 when he came of age, possibly to secure safety for his family since it wasn't on the central plains that were being heavily resisted, and to enjoy the peace and prosperity of the West. Now, this prosperity out west would lead to some sort of extravagance and luxury, which Dong He would very much shun and denounce. He would enter Liu Zhang's service, and he tried to set a positive example by leading an austere life. So he'd wear plain clothing, and he would also pursue a vegetarian diet, which was pretty unusual. He had a stern demeanor, and this set a powerful example, and other officials were actually ashamed to misbehave around him, or to have fun around him even. So this did have a moral impact. He was not necessarily the most popular man among the elite. So if you're a local elite, most likely you were not a big fan of Dong He. And at one point, they were able to persuade Liu Zhang to reassign him somewhere else. But the common people loved him, and so they were angry that this had happened. When Liu Bei conquers Shu, Dong He will be one of the men he hires, and he'll make him a senior administrator alongside of Zhuge Liang. The two of them will get along really well, and apparently they would agree on most issues. Dong He will die in 221, and Zhuge Liang will miss him pretty badly. And he would often bring him up in conversation and talk about what a great friend Dong He was, and also talk about things that Dong He had said or done. So Dong He was one of the favorite conversation pieces for Zhuge Liang. Despite decades as a governor in a remote, unsupervised area and then a senior post in Shu, Dong He at no point in his career enriched himself, and so when he died, his family was at the exact same level of wealth as when he entered service. So, other than his salary, he never dipped his hand in the cookie jar. And that was very rare, by the way. And for that alone, I think this man warrants a B. Just for being truly not corrupt. Back here. There we go. Alright. Next up, we have Dong Yun, who is the son of Dong Hae. So Dong Yun had actually been a prime minister very briefly. Or excuse me, no, Dong He will be a prime minister. So he will be after Zhuge Liang and Jiang Wei, but before Fei Yi. And I haven't talked about him before because of the 4 prime ministers, he is by far the least important. So he will not have that long of a time, and he also will not be as impactful. So, his father had died recently when he's appointed to office around 221, and he becomes palace attendant. And he specifically is assigned to Liu Shan, the crown prince. And that will be important because Liu Shan will become emperor within 2 years. And now that he's around the new emperor, he will be receiving Zhuge Liang once Zhuge Liang becomes prime minister. Dong Yun will have a strong character, and Zhuge Liang, who had trusted his father a great deal, will now bestow that trust upon him. And so Dong Yun will largely control Chengdu when Zhuge Liang goes on campaign. And he holds down the fort admirably, administers things well and fairly, and so Zhuge Liang continues to promote him. In fact, when he was dying, Zhuge Liang advised Liu Shan to turn to Dong Yun and Fei Yi anytime he needed something. And also, if he's wondering about how to comport himself, then they are the men he should try to imitate. So, Zhuge Liang, in many ways, was still trying to educate Liu Shan. Now, one of the strengths of Dong Yun is that unlike many of his colleagues who were very much averse to confrontation, Dong Yun was perfectly capable of telling you what's what and not beating around the bush. And so because of that, when he was partnered with Fei Yi, it almost always fell upon him to be the bad cop. That being said, while he did have a stern side to him, he also had a fun-loving part. And he was known to casually hang out with people like Fei Yi and have a good time. So he was a fairly balanced person. He could be very stern in public, but in private he could be charming if needed. He was always, or at least typically, respectful. And he also had the respect of men like Zhuge Liang and Zhang Wan. That being said, one of the things he had going against him is that Liu Shan didn't really like him that much, because much of the sternness that Dong Yun displayed was to hold back the emperor. And by this point, Liu Shan is a grown man, and he feels like he's being treated like a boy. But he won't really come out and directly challenge Dong Yun because he's a little bit too intimidated by him. And one of the points of contention is that Dong Yun refuses to grant the emperor's request to expand his harem. So traditionally, harems are supposed to be only 12 women, and Liu Shan wanted a bigger harem, and Dong Yun said no. So not only did he refuse to allow the number to increase, but he also shot down a proposal to allow more women to be recruited or to have a recruitment drive for those 12 spots, because he thought it would be a waste of money. And so, this created some personal animosity to the point where, at one point, Zhang Wan suggested that Liu Shan should grant Dong Yun a peerage, so make him a marquis, and then Dong Yun, predicting that this would go badly for him if he got rejected, and he might get rejected, what he did was simply request to not get it, to turn down the honor, because he knew that there was a good chance Liu Shan would either directly refuse, or that he would sort of sit on the issue and make it super awkward and uncomfortable for everybody. And so, Dong Yun showed some skill here and some talent by avoiding what could have become a minor political crisis, and also probably a career-ending episode for himself. When Liu Shan became friends with Huang Hao, Dong Yun decided to crack down on Huang Hao. And so he made life uncomfortable for him, and he warned the emperor repeatedly that this eunuch was a fool, and also that anyone who listened to the man was equally a fool. Dong Yun would die in 246, although his death seems to have been something of a slow creep. So it appears that his illness came on him slowly. This was not a relatively sudden thing like what happened with Zhuge Liang. This was more protracted. And because of his high reputation and the high reputation he inherited from his father, his grandson will actually be rewarded with a governorship in the West by the Jin dynasty, because they want to play up families that already have a lot of name recognition, and so they chose Dong Yun's grandson to serve as a kind of mascot in this area. Overall, I think that Dong Yun is a worthy successor to his father, and I will place him beside him in the B category. He's just as good, if not a little better, but not dramatically different. Hell Chat. Hell the Watcher. Alright. Chen Ji. So he's possibly related to Chen Zhen, who had been a leading official early in Shu's history, prior to dying in 235. At any rate, though, Chen Ji will be one of the last stars to emerge in the Shu Han government. We do know that he was raised by his granduncle Zhu Jing, who was a Shu official, and so we also know that he got a first-rate education. He entered service at a very young age, at 19, and he was regarded as something of a polymath. So he was already famous for being smart. He was known for his skills in astrology, divination, and physiognomy, which is the study of facial features. He also was a big beneficiary of Fei Yi. So Fei Yi was already prime minister when he came of age, and Fei Yi was prime minister from 246 to 253. And so he arranged for Chen Ji to succeed Dong Yun as palace attendant. There's a pretty good chance that Chen Ji and Fei Yi went back some time. That being said, all the evidence is that Chen Ji was still very young when he was appointed, so most likely this was very much more of a mentor-mentee relationship rather than the two guys being friends in the more traditional sense. What is also clear, though, is that Chen Ji had spent quite a bit of time at court, and that he was already friendly with Liu Shan and the eunuch Huang Hao. So if his mentor was hoping that he would help to keep the wedge open between Huang Hao and power, they unfortunately had chosen the wrong guy. So once he gets into office, Chen Ji will be a vocal critic of Dong Yun, and he will largely side with Huang Hao on policy. And so he would make sure that the eunuch now had a lot of influence. And so once Dong Yun is dead, Chen Ji will now constantly be at the second emperor's side as well with Huang Hao. In 251, Liu Shan, who now really liked Chen Ji, will put him in charge of the bureaucracy. That office is called the Prefect of the Masters of Writing. So he's effectively the head bureaucrat. His military rank will be lower than Zhang Wei, but nevertheless, he has about equal influence because he heads the bureaucracy and is next to the emperor every day. So he can just walk in and talk to the emperor pretty much whenever he wants to, whereas Zhang Wei lives out on the frontier. So the two of them will be kind of rivals. That being said, I do think, and I'll talk about this more later, that Zhang Wei's conflicts with the government are vastly overstated, because obviously he was given permission to invade the north 11 times. So that conflict couldn't have been that bad. So Chen Ji, despite forming a friendship with the hated Huang Hao, and in general all eunuchs are hated, by the way. That is kind of a rule of thumb. Whenever you have landed aristocrats trying to share a government with the eunuchs will be lambasted to no end. Despite that, though, Chen Ji will retain the trust of most of the major players in Shu Han. When he'll die suddenly at an early age on September 28, 258, Liu Shan will lament that the state has suffered a terrible loss. And without him, Huang Hao will be the man that the emperor turns to. And Huang Hao's power will grow, corruption supposedly spreads, And I'm a little skeptical of that because things couldn't go completely to shit in just 5 years, one. And then two, Huang Hao is mostly despised because, again, he's a eunuch. And aristocrats always hate them and massacre them when they can. So the idea of corruption being associated with eunuchs is just kind of like a given whenever you have a eunuch being mentioned in a source. That's sort of just a trope where they're automatically considered corrupt just for existing. Now, I think there's a good chance that because of his high position at a young age and Fei Yi's backing, that Chen Ji was already on his way to being sort of like the next prime minister or equivalent thereof, because now Liu Shan was not really needing someone to be quite that hands-on like a Zhuge Liang figure, but Chen Ji was kind of like the next evolution of that, but his career was cut short by his early death, and so we never really got to see what he could do. If we do accept that Huang Hao was sort of the origin of all evil, then we could rate Chen Ji lower. However, despite his reputation for brilliance, he didn't really do anything brilliant either. And so at the end of the day, I have to rank him as a C. And it appears that I reproduced two images without realizing it. Oh well. It's whatever. We'll just go with it. We'll just assume that Chen Ji and Dong Yun were twins. Or not Dong Yun, but whoever that was, because Dong Yun is a step above. And next up, we have a man we've mentioned multiple times, Zhang Wan. And by this point, my throat is struggling. Okay, so Zhang Wan is someone who served as prime minister. He seems to have entered service around 210 or so in southern Jing. His specialty will be administration. But like all Chinese officials at this time, he could potentially do anything. So he could command armies, he could head a bureau, he could do damn near anything. His cousin was named Liu Min. And so because of that detail, there's a decent chance that he's indirectly related to Liu Bei and the Han Dynasty more broadly. So that obviously would help his career prospects a good deal, especially since he's serving in the kingdom that has the sort of pretension of being loyalist. After accompanying the army in the conquest of Yi province, he then got put in charge of a rural commandery. And at one point, Liu Bei did an inspection and found Zhang Wan passed out drunk. And Zhuge Liang interceded and said that the reason for this is that Zhang Wan was being misused, that his talents were simply too great for such a small task. And so Liu Bei decided to relieve him and bring him back to Chengdu. Now, he did have to serve for a time unemployed because of his crime of not taking his job seriously, but ultimately he was kind of rewarded because they recognized his talents were too great to be squandered governing some sleepy crossroads somewhere. Once he gets back to Chengdu, he'll do much, much better. And in fact, when he was on his time out, he consulted a seer who told him that he was destined to achieve the rank of duke one day, meaning that he was going to be a big player. In his capacity as advisor and administrator at the capital, he really thrived in a way that he hadn't when he was employed in a rural office. He handled most of the logistics for Zhuge Liang's 5 northern campaigns, and he took charge after Zhang Yi died in 230. His performance in the task of being the sort of logistics master impressed Zhuge Liang enough that he ended up telling Liu Shan that if something happened to him, that Zhang Wan should be the next prime minister. And as we know, that's what ended up happening. When Zhuge Liang did die, there was some doubt about Zhang Wan, and that probably was only made worse when Wei Yan was murdered soon thereafter Zhuge Liang's death. However, by keeping calm and carrying on, and by simply doing a good job rather than worrying about people's opinions of him, Zhang Wan was able to win over people's support. And so, over time, he gradually won over his fellow officers, and within a few years, they all agreed that he was a worthy successor to Zhuge Liang. And so, they trusted him deeply, and followed him just like they would Zhuge Liang. He also had a pretty good even temperament, which was suitable for his high office, because we know that there are a lot of very jealous officers around. And so at one point, a report got through to him that one of his subordinates said that he was mediocre and unworthy to be prime minister. And so Zhang Wan said, indeed, that it's true that he can't compare to the great men of the past. And so he said, yeah, the guy who's critiquing me is not wrong. I'm not as great as some of the great prime ministers of the past. And this person would keep on bashing Zhang Wan. And later on, this person got into legal trouble with someone else. And so when Zhang Wan was called upon to serve as judge, the expectation was that because this man had been bashing him to anyone who would listen, that Zhang Wan would get his revenge. But instead, Zhang Wan decided not to do that. He decided to hear the case impartially, and he found that this guy was not really guilty of what he's being accused of. And so he had the man acquitted. And so the man did not have to pay a fine which would have crippled his financial circumstances. Early in his time as prime minister, Zhang Wan would take up station at Hanzhong to be commander-in-chief, but trying to be both commander-in-chief and head the bureaucracy broke down his health the same way it probably did the Zhuge Liang, and so by 243 he withdrew his headquarters to a more salubrious location, and then started to build up his successors, including Fei Yi, who would be the next prime minister, and Zhang Wei, who would become the next general-in-chief. Zhang Wan also engaged in critical analysis of Zhuge Liang's campaigns, and he said that the problem, and the reason why it failed, is that Zhuge Liang's path was too difficult logistically, and it was too mountainous. And so he said, instead what we need to do is go from Tian Shui in the west and use the rivers, the Yellow River and its tributaries, in order to make our transportation more efficient and give ourselves more time. Because moving through mountain passes, we have to burn a lot of our supplies up getting stuff through. If we use the rivers, it's far more efficient. So this plan was pretty smart. That being said, his failing health and the opposition within the government started to really take its toll. And the big objection to his plan was that while it would indeed be better logistically, it would be harder to retreat if something went wrong. And so, before his plans could be implemented, Zhang Wan fell ill and died. And this happened in November of 226. And then his duties were now broken up between Fei Yi, Dong Yun, and Zhang Wei. So that succession was about as smooth as was possible. And the relative peace during and after Zhang Wan's time as prime minister was what allowed the Shu state to fund the various northern expeditions of Zhang Wei. So, in many ways, Zhang Wan was the guy who was the best administrator, probably even better than Zhuge Liang. Overall, I'd rate his performance as an A. He came in with a pretty tall task. The state was in a pretty rough state after Zhuge Liang's northern campaigns failed, after he died, and then, of course, after the murder of Wei Yan. But Zhang Wan was able to restore confidence and also build Shu back up without sacrificing all that much. So to me, he is an A. Next up, we have another senior official, and that is Dong Ji, but it's spelled Dang, D-E-N-G, but it's probably pronounced Dong. Anyway, Dong Ji is the descendant of a high official from the Han court. He migrated to the land of Shu before Liu Bei conquered it. A horoscope that he had as a young man said that he would live to be over 70 and become a high-ranking general. And remember, in ancient Chinese terms, 70 is really old. First, he entered Liu Zhang's service, then later he joined Liu Bei. He seems to have been a little too junior to be a part of the coup, though. He also would develop a reputation for being incorruptible and stern. And so at first, this would lead him to be transferred to Chengdu. He was present in 223 when Liu Bei died, and Zhuge Liang was presiding over a meeting about the future of Shu. Dong Ji emphasized that they needed to make a relationship better with Wu. Zhuge Liang agreed, and he said, well, you seem to understand the situation, why don't you go meet with Wu and make things right? And so Dong Ji took over that task. Not only did he manage to establish peace and understanding between Shu and Wu, but he also actually became really good friends with Sun Quan, or Sun Xuan, I guess is it's pronounced. And when Sun Xuan hesitated, Dongzhi reasoned with him and said that Eastern Wu would be exposed if Shu were to fall, because they were reliant upon the Yangtze River. And one way to get around the Yangtze was from the west, but that currently wasn't possible because of Shu's existence. And so because he spoke so candidly, Sun Xuan was really impressed. And he wrote a letter to Zhuge Liang saying, "Thank you for sending Dongzhi. He's a very charming guy, and I like him a lot. And I hope to see him again. So I hope if we ever have to talk again, you'll send him back." And actually, it's interesting because the two of them became such good friends that Sun Xuan and Dongzhi actually became pen pals and also sent gifts to each other. So they became quite close in that very limited time. His best-known deeds were his 2 visits to Wu, but he also did serve in the army. In 228, he co-commanded the diversionary force in the First Northern Campaign, alongside of Zhao Yun. And when I say co-commanded, I think it's pretty obvious that he clearly was junior to Zhao Yun, because Zhao Yun by this time was a living legend, and he was just some asshole. But I guess he was there because of Zhao Yun's age, as a backup. Anyway, during that battle, they lost and got demoted, and of course, Dongzhi was among the many who said that Zhao Yun was the hero there, who kept their force together and intact when it was faced with a far superior force, and that he kept casualties low. After Zhuge Liang died, Dongzhi became the frontier commander in the southeast at Jiangzhou, and he became about as respected as Ma Zhong and Wang Ping, both of whom did similar jobs elsewhere in areas that were probably more sensitive. Now, due to the mostly defensive posture of Shu during this time, Dongzhi didn't really have a lot of opportunities to shine. He also would have been facing Wu, with whom they were at peace, and so he didn't get to fight Wei that much, except when he was called up to participate sometimes. And actually, despite his posting in the southeast, he would actually be in the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th. Or actually, he could have participated, I'm sorry, I don't know if he did, in the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th Northern campaigns. And in general, it's likely that he served in at least one of them because we know that Zhang Wei had a very high opinion of Dongzhi. Whereas in general, Dongzhi actually was not on very good terms with most of the officers. And it seems that he tended to not get along very well with the scholarly types. So the guys who were well learned, like the guy we talked about earlier, Chen Ji. That would not be somebody that Dongzhi would get along with. We do know of one campaign where he was definitely not present, though, and that's the 3rd expedition of 248. And that's because he put down a revolt by a client kingdom. And during this revolt, he happened to be out hunting and he saw an ape. And he shot it down with his crossbow. And then he followed it, and the ape wandered off and then removed the bolt, treated the wounds with twigs and mud, and moved on with his life. And Dongzhi apparently was so impressed by this ape that he didn't fire again, and later said that he must have violated nature's laws and that he would soon perish for doing so. And then 3 years later, he did die in 251. To me, Dongzhi seems like an interesting guy, seems likable, but he's kind of like a Lord Mountbatten type figure. He's just not that impressive, really. Interesting, sure. Maybe he'd have been a good friend. Maybe he would have been good to have a beer with. Certainly he seems competent, but he doesn't seem like anything special, and I'm going to slot him at a C. Next up, we have the aforementioned Ma Zhong. Not to be confused with Mahjong the game, but Mahjong with a ZH. So M-A-Z-H-O-N-G. And he's not related to any of the other Ma's we've talked about, by the way. He also is not to be confused with a Wu officer named Mahjong, who helped to capture Guan Yu. So he hails from the area known as Baji, which is kind of that area south of Hanzhong, that will later be a part of Shu. And Mahjong languished in obscurity until he was dispatched to Yang'an to help reconstitute the army that was shattered at Yiling. So before this, he lived in obscurity, and now he'll be a major part of the military because it just got shattered, and they're looking for fresh talent. At this point, Ma Zhang will meet with Liu Bei for the first time, even though apparently he's been in service for a while, and Liu Bei will be deeply impressed by him. And Liu Bei, coming into this, had been deeply downcast, not only because he lost so many people to natural causes, but then he lost a number of people at Yiling. And so he said that Ma Zhang had the potential to be another Huang Quan. And he said, I'm actually optimistic now, because I know that in this land, there's not a shortage of talented men. No matter how many talented men fall, there will always be more. And so Ma Zhang allowed Liu Bei to die with at least some hope for the future. During the southern campaign of 225, Ma Zhang will be very active. He'll put down a revolt quickly, he'll win over the locals, and then he will actually govern an area for 5 years until he's summoned north to participate in the northern expeditions. Here he'll work with Zhang Ni and others fighting the Qiang tribe. They will subdue the Qiang in 231. Then in 233, he'll have to deal with a massive revolt in the south, which had overwhelmed another general named Zhang Yi. Once again, he's going to come in, and he will deal with the troublesome local populations. He also will prove to be very good at one thing that's super important both in Liang and in the south, and that's managing relations between the Chinese and non-Chinese. So today we call the Chinese people Han as an ethnicity. Back in this period, the Han population was not necessarily as overwhelming a majority as it is now. So today it's like 94% of China. Back then it was still the majority, but by no means was everyone fully Sinicized. And so one of the special skills that Ma Zhang brought to the table is that he was very good at dealing with non-Chinese. And so he'll now remain in the south the rest of his career because of how good he is at maintaining peace here and providing troops and supplies and things that are needed up north. That being said, although he is sidelined a bit, he will be frequently consulted on policy. And he also will sometimes go on inspections in order to advise the emperor better. So while he is not on the front lines, he's still one of the major grandees of Shu. So he's kind of playing the role that He Qi played in Wu. Someone who is extremely important, but didn't really make it that big in the sources because he's involved in things that are kind of not being highlighted. At one point when Fei Yi will go north to fight, Ma Zhang will move north as well and govern at Chengdu for a while as a kind of regent. Ma Zhang's life will end in 249, and at that time his reputation was strong enough that the Shu government decided to simply allow his son Ma Zhu to become the new governor. And so that seems to have worked. Ma Zhu was pretty successful, and after the Jin conquest, the Jin government will also decide to just simply go with the Ma family because of how much purchase they have with the locals. And so the office will then go to Ma Zhang's second son because Ma Zhu apparently died, and then later on it will go to one of the grandsons. So Ma Zhang kind of set up a tiny dynasty in a way because of his popularity with the locals. And to me, Ma Zhang, although we don't know that much about him, the man's clearly very talented, and I'll put him in the A category because he did his job very well and held down the fort in a very literal way in an area that was not easy to govern. Next up we have Zhang Ni. He's from the area around Chengdu. He entered service as soon as he came of age, and he was known not only for his warrior skills, but also for his willingness to put himself in danger. His reputation is based almost entirely, however, on campaigns fought against bandits and his popularity as a governor among non-Han people. So in many ways, he's a lot like Ma Zhang. And much like Ma Zhang, he's also very successful. When Liu Zhang's government collapsed, bandits were taking advantage of the chaos to attack a county office. And when that happened, Zhang Ni, who was still fairly junior, sprang into action, and he saved the wife and family of his boss, who otherwise might have been killed in the fracas. At any rate, Zhang Ni's conduct attracted Liu Bei's praise, and he decided to hire Zhang Ni. Although Zhang Ni apparently made some sort of special side arrangement where technically he served the quote-unquote real Han dynasty. So in theory, he's an appointee of Luo Yang, but in practice, he's working for Liu Bei. And this goes back to what I talked about at the outset, where sometimes the relationships between different officers, if we looked at what those relationships actually are in a legal sense, might not be as clear-cut as we think. At any rate, though, Zhang Ni, in theory, serves the Han, not Shu Han. But of course, I'm sure that changed once Liu Bei became emperor. During the mobilization for the First Northern Campaign, which started in 227, bandits decided to take advantage of troops being concentrated at the border and started ravaging the interior. And Zhang Ni will act on his own accord to deal with this. The bandits turned down a battle with him, and so he held a banquet of reconciliation to try to make peace with them and talk to them reasonably. And the bandits decided to do that. And so the leaders went to this banquet. But then instead of meeting with them, Zhang Ni instead had them killed and then followed them up and went to their various dens and killed them. And this led to a 10-day blood orgy. Soon thereafter, Zhang Ni fell seriously ill, and it looked like he was about to die, and he also couldn't afford a doctor. But luckily for him, there was another senior official in Shu named He Ji, and he offered his services for free because he himself was not only a governor, but also a very skilled physician. And so Zhang Ni actually resigned his offices and went to live with Governor He Ji. So for several years, Zhang Ni is actually going to be on the sidelines receiving medical treatment. And probably everybody expected him to simply die, but he doesn't. Even though it takes several years, he will actually make a full recovery and return to service. And he'll be just in time to fight against the Qiang tribe in the northwest. And then later on, he also will then fight the minorities in the south who elevate a man named Liu Zhou to be their leader. And although it had been several years and he had probably been bedridden for part of that time, he showed no rust whatsoever. And once again, he was already back in shape and back in the midst of things. He was in the front ranks, kicking ass. And he also had evolved a little bit more too, because now not only was he a great warrior, but he had also evolved as a planner. So not only would he just be a bravo in the front ranks in these campaigns, he also was planning them. So he was now the complete package. In the battle with Liu Zhou, he actually will personally behead this non-Chinese ruler. And we have a lot of things that made it into fiction or folklore about people killing each other in one-on-one combat. Most of them are not that historical, but this one actually is historically attested. So Zhang Ni actually did kill Liu Zhou with his own hand. And that's one of the few times we can say with confidence this actually happened. This was not just hyperbole or poetic exaggeration. In 236, a small expedition in the north went missing, and Zhang Ni correctly predicted that the ruler who invited them had been sincere, but that his brother, who was disloyal, must have revolted and caused problems for the general who was dispatched. And so that proved to be exactly what happened, so people now respected Zhang Ni's powers of prediction that much more. Later on, he also suppressed a group called the Sukiyi tribes. Then after that, he's going to spend 3 years in the area rebuilding the city walls and infrastructure. He also will build and maintain roads and communications networks to the west of Chengdu. So Chengdu is kind of on the frontier itself, even though it's the capital, but he will help extend control somewhat out to the west. And despite the fact that he's mostly concerned in matters that are not on the frontier or in the capital, he's still very much abreast of all the major political developments of his era. And he also will make very accurate predictions, even though he's often not present for a lot of the things that he's making predictions about. And in many cases, he doesn't personally know the people he's making predictions about, yet he has such a feel for reading reports and seeing sort of between the lines that he's able to make these predictions. So for instance, a good example is that he predicted the downfall of Zhuge Ke, who I believe was a Wei general, even though he had never met the man or traveled there. In 254, he now returned to Chengdu, and he was very well received. He was universally beloved within the Shu kingdom. And that's despite the fact that his morals and manners were both a little rough. So he's the kind of guy who is not necessarily well coiffed, I guess you could say. He's not very well put together compared to some of these other guys. Not very cultured, but he's still someone who has a lot of charisma and also someone who's clearly very capable and has contributed a lot. Now, this is the same year that Xiahou Ba came into Shu. So Xiahou Ba is a defector from Wei, and he joined Shu. And the first person Xiahou Ba wanted to meet was actually Zhang Ni, because Zhang Ni was famous even in Wei. But Zhang Ni very much put the brakes on Xiahou Ba's request that they immediately become best friends. He says, dude, come on, let's get to know each other a little bit. I don't know you, you don't know me. We don't know if we want to be friends. The next year, 255, is the 8th Northern Campaign of Zhang Wei. Of course, Xiahou Ba would debut in this campaign. And Zhang Ni is now eager to participate, despite the fact that he was kind of retired from active operations. By this point, he had bad arthritis, and he could only get around with a cane. Nonetheless, he went to Liu Shan and forced the unemotional emperor to cry, because he said he's willing to sacrifice himself to gain Liang province. And so Liu Shan appointed him governor in anticipation of taking it, and allowed him to accompany the army. At this time, no one believed that he would be able to keep up or participate or fight in the front ranks, and yet, that's exactly what he did. In the Battle of Zhangwu, Zhang Ni would die fighting in the front ranks in a victory, which happens to be, by the way, probably the most substantial victory Zhang Wei ever won. And a lot of that is due to Zhang Ni's sacrifice here. When he died, he was greatly mourned. A temple was erected, and Liu Shan decided to enfeoff both of his sons. Later on, as we've already seen happen several times, the Jin dynasty turned to one of his grandsons and made him a governor in order to capitalize on the fact that Zhang Ni was such a respected and beloved figure. And so, I think it's not controversial to say, Zhang Ni, solid A. Excellent officer for a very long time, and he's another example of someone who was keeping the interior quiet and productive, and this is especially important because, remember, Shu was smaller and weaker than Wei. So for them to be able to hold the frontier or even mount offensives meant that they needed all the resources together. They couldn't afford to have areas in revolt. And so men like Zhang Ni and like his predecessor here, we just talked about, Ma Zhang, were extremely important. So they will not play a big role if you were to say, read Romance of the Three Kingdoms, because they're not involved in the fighting between the three kingdoms directly, but still, they are massively important, and I want to make sure that's clear. All right. Next up, we have Zhang Yi, who apparently is from a different set of Zhangs altogether, and is not related to Zhang Fei or to Zhang Ni. In fact, he claims his descent from the great general Zhang Liang, who was active all the way back in the former Han. So we're talking about the centuries BCE, so at least 200 years. And Zhang Yi is first recorded on Liu Bei's staff as early as the conquest of Shu, so 211 to 214. He mostly gets employed in administrative roles, although in those roles he also had a small army to enforce his will. He was known for being a strict enforcer of the law, and this made him not terribly popular with common people. And so when Liu Zhu revolts in the south in 231, Zhuge Liang will recall Zhang Yi, thinking that he can't win, and so he'll send Ma Zhang instead. However, Zhang Yi decided rather than to go immediately, to instead wait for his successor. And during the time he's waiting, he not only just waits idly, but instead he raises troops, gathers supplies, even mounts some limited operations with the loyal men he does have. And so this not only will impress and help out Ma Zhang, but this will also make Zhuge Liang reconsider and think, you know what, maybe there's more to this guy than I realized. And so Zhuge Liang will start to favor him, and then after Zhuge Liang's death, his career will continue to improve. He becomes a marquis. He also becomes a commander on the front lines, and he will become an influential figure in major debates. By 255, he's in a feud with Zhang Wei. And all this revolves around the northern expedition. Zhang Wei, of course, led those expeditions and was a huge advocate of them, whereas Zhang Yi thought that they were foolish and that it would break Shu by overstretching its limited resources. And so, because Zhang Yi was seen as a somewhat dangerous opponent, Zhang Wei would invite him on the expeditions. And so, despite the fact that he opposed the expeditions, Zhang Yi was on a lot of them. And in fact, when Zhang Wei won his greatest victory at Daidao in 255, where he crushed General Wang Jing and killed tens of thousands of Wei soldiers, Zhang Yi was there. And so Zhang Wei wanted to follow this up by taking the city of Daidao, but Zhang Yi said, we can't do it. We should just retreat and take our victory for what it is, because we don't have the logistics to do it. And we also can't resist if we're put in a siege and then enemy forces arrive. And he's proven right, despite the fact that he really infuriated Zhang Wei with his advice. And the Wei general Chen Tai would arrive, and so that will screw up everything for Zhang Wei's plans. And the Shu army has to then break the siege and retreat. Xiahou Ba, who we'll talk about more in a minute, dies in 259, and at that time Zhang Yi will succeed him as general of chariots. And so that will actually make him have to work more with Zhang Wei, despite the fact that they hate each other. In 263, he's still in service, and he's stationed on the eastern frontier, with instructions to reinforce other armies as needed. By this point, Zhang Wei has had a kind of flexible deployment. They've also called up troops closer to Chengdu, because they know that Wei is planning a massive invasion. And so, it's this man, Zhang Yi, who's entrusted with kind of like the mobile reserve. And what ends up happening is that he will end up reinforcing Zhang Wei at Jianmen Pass. But although that seemed like a wise move at the time, it turns out that Zhang Yi might have deployed a little bit prematurely, because the main thrust actually came from Deng Ai, who appeared unexpectedly right in front of Chengdu and defeated the kind of ad hoc army that Zhuge Liang's son put together. And so this is when the emperor decided to throw in the towel. And so effectively what will happen is that Zhang Hui will receive the army of Zhang Wei and Zhang Yi without really defeating it. So this army will still be intact, still be under arms. And so Zhang Hui, because he's now got not only loyal men to himself, but also these loyal Shu troops, will start to try to revolt. And of course, for men like Zhang Yi and Zhang Wei, they're thinking, we can use this chaos to restart Shu. So we can reclaim Chengdu and declare Shu independent again. But instead what happens is that this attempt to win over his men will fail, and Zhuang He will die alongside of Zhang Yi and Zhang Wei. So, Zhang Yi will end up dying alongside of the general who defeated him and accepted his surrender, and alongside of the man he opposed for over a decade. And they were together in some madcap scheme to overthrow the Wei government under Sima Zhao at that time. So they're starting to become Jin. And this failure will make sure the Jin dynasty does rise and replace the Wei dynasty. Zhang Yi is one of those three men I mentioned earlier who saw Shu Han from its rise to its fall. And of those three men, he's the only one who's still active. The other two are basically retired and are in their dotage. So they are very old men by this point. But Zhang Yi was probably getting older, but he's still active. In terms of ranking Zhang Yi, I have him as a B. I feel like he did make one major mistake in how he committed the reserve during the 263 campaign, but partly I attribute that failure to just the sheer brilliance of Dong Ai. And Dong Ai honestly might be the best general of this whole period for any faction. So losing to Dong Ai, or because of Dong Ai, I guess it wasn't directly, yeah, but losing to Dong Ai is not anything to be ashamed of, because Dong Ai was a beast. Next up, we have Zong Yu. So Zong Yu has never struck enough modern interest to get any kind of inclusion or face portrait from Koei that I'm aware of. That being said, interestingly enough, he does have a biographical entry in the San Guo Ji, the collection of biographies about this period. And in fact, we know a lot of details about him despite the fact that he has not been popular with modern readers. He was born in 187, so we know his exact date of birth, unlike most of these guys. And due to his age, he most likely entered service when Liu Bei was in Jing province in the 200s. He served under Zhang Fei in 214 during the drive on Chengdu. After the death of Zhuge Liang, he went to Sun Quan to allay tensions. And so this was because Shu reinforced the frontier. Zong Yu said there's no reason to inquire why either side had built up their defenses. And Sun Quan was won over. He tended to really like outspoken guys. And the two men also remained good friends. So much like with Dong Zhi, Sun Quan had another good friend in Shu and Zong Yu. And this friendship would last all the way until Sun Quan died in 252. So the two of them were friends for a very long time. 40 years almost. On Zong Yu's last visit, because he visited on many occasions, the aging Wu Emperor embraced him tearfully and cried about how old they both were now and said that they would never get to meet again. And so, in order to celebrate their last meeting and show his appreciation for Zong Yu, he bestowed upon him a massive amount of pearls, enough probably to make Zong Yu wealthy. That being said, while Sun Quan was near the end of his life, Zong Yu was merely old but not done. And in fact, he will remain alive for quite a number of years beyond this. In fact, he was still young enough, at least in his own reckoning, to accept a new military command. Dong Zhi very much opposed this because he said men over 60 are not supposed to bear arms, and effectively demanded that Zong Yu immediately resign. However, Zong Yu struck back by saying to Dong Zhi, "Dude, you're older than I am. You're over 70, and you have a command. I'm only 60. What the fuck? Why enforce the law so ridiculously hypocritically?" And that was enough to make people kind of take note of Zong Yu. Because Dong Zhi tended to be a very intimidating guy. And so the fact that Zong Yu called him on his bullshit in this way earned him a lot of cred. He was still holding office when Shu fell, although by this point he was virtually retired due to old age. And when the equally elderly Liao Hua suggested that the two go on together to curry favor with Zhuge Liang's son, Zhuge Zhan, who at this point had become the major power in Chengdu right before the fall of the government, Zong Yu kind of laughed. And he said, "I'm too old for this kind of bullshit. I'm too old to be seeking honors, and so are you, Liao Hua. What are we going to do? Win favor and then die the next day? Win an office that we can't actually perform? What's the point? I'm just going to stay here and hang out. You should do the same. We can't really accomplish anything at this point in our lives, so why bother?" He was present when Shu was conquered in 263, and along with Liao Hua, he was ordered to relocate to Luoyang, but both of these men over 70 died on the route. And so, neither one of them made it, and he is the third of the three men who saw Shu from its beginning to its end that we know about. Zhang Yu was blunt, he lived a long life, but beyond that, he was not all that interesting. He seems to have done his job pretty competently, but in many cases, he may well have just been imitating the behavior of Dongji, Ma Zong, and other people who previously went to Wu and simply spoke their mind. To me, Zhang Yu doesn't really stand out that much. I'm sure he probably was a little bit funny, but beyond that, he's not the biggest deal in the world. I'm going to put him in a C tier, for lack of a better place to put him. And now we're going to have a major controversial figure. The man who was featured in today's thumbnail. And that is Zhang Wei. So Zhang Wei was born in 202, meaning that he is a full generation younger pretty much than even guys like Zhuge Liang. So he's a different generation altogether, and that means he's about 2 generations younger than Liu Bei. He was born around the city of Tianshui, which at this time was in Wei, or at least controlled by Wei. It was in the north in Liang province. His father was a local official who died young, and Zhang Wei will follow in his dad's footsteps. He'll enter Wei, and he will be a junior officer around 227 or 228. A later Zhen source, which is of course hostile to Zhang Wei, will say that he was a deeply ambitious man who had his own private militia. But most likely, this is a bit of an attack on him that was written after his attempt to revive Shu in 264. Zhang Wei was very well educated. He was a Confucian scholar. He was very enthusiastic and even had a scholar he favored who was a kind of minor interpreter, and Zhang Wei would argue for his specific version of Confucianism. Now, Zhuge Liang, in his first northern campaign, was targeting Tianshui. And so when he approached the city, Zhang Wei's boss apparently began to suspect that Zhang Wei was planning to defect, so he opted to bolt himself and flee. And now Zhang Wei, who apparently was not planning that, found himself isolated with a small number of men and forced to surrender to Shu. Zhuge Liang immediately came to like the young man. What's interesting is that Wei accounts, which are usually hostile to any Shu officers, especially someone who was born in their territory and defected, actually are a little bit more generous than the Zhen account, because it says that Zhang Wei had no intention to defect, and that this decision was rough on him because Wei decided to keep all of his relatives under armed guard. So effectively, because Zhang Wei was forced to join Shu, Wei didn't retaliate against his family, but they did keep a watch on his relatives. And apparently, Zhang Wei behaved himself with enough class and dignity that Wei never fully retaliated against his relatives. So unlike Ma Chao, he did not bring death upon his house, merely house arrest. Now, for Zhuge Liang, the acquisition of Zhang Wei was a bit of a silver lining to a campaign that was overall disastrous. After the disaster at Jiting, Zhuge Liang, of course, killed Ma Su. And in many ways, it appears that Zhang Wei became the new apprentice. Although he was actually a lot younger than Ma Su, who's only in his 20s at the time. And Zhuge Liang had learned a valuable lesson at Jiting, which is never to entrust young commanders with massive responsibilities. And so, under Zhuge Liang, Zhang Wei would be more of like a staff officer, rather than someone who was holding major commands. That being said, he most likely did play a role in planning and executing at many of the later northern campaigns, because he and Zhuge Liang became pretty close. At Wuzhang Plains in 234, after the battle, Zhang Wei was promoted, and then for the next 4 years he'll spend that time at Chengdu. And it's not clear exactly why he was here. It might be simply because the new Prime Minister, Zhang Wan, didn't want more fighting in the north, and he knew that Zhang Wei was a huge advocate of continuing the campaigns. Or it may have been actually the new prime minister helping Zhang Wei by trying to give him a more balanced experience and by letting him make some connections here. And it appears that Zhang Wei used his time pretty wisely, because although we have many later instances of him running into conflict with people at the capital, apparently he did still have enough supporters there that his northern campaigns kept going and going and going. So he apparently had made a very strong impression on Liu Shan or on a number of other people. Now, Zhang Wei by this point still has no senior command experience, but he did have a lot of experience overall due to being involved in Zhuge Liang's campaigns. And so, in 238, when Prime Minister Zhang Wan returned to Hanzhong and started to take a more aggressive stance, Zhang Wei also went north, but he seems to have commanded more in like the northwest, at this time at least. And in 240, he actually is going to lead a separate invasion force that was a sort of secondary operation. And I think this has been unfairly and inaccurately labeled as the first northern campaign of Zhang Wei. Although clearly Zhang Wan was the initiator and led the main force, whereas Zhang Wei was playing the subsidiary role. And by the way, even though they have the same last name, I don't think they're related. Or same family name. As for Zhang Wei's thrust, it failed completely, and not only did he fail to win over the Qiang tribes, but after he was repulsed, the Wei commander who was opposed to him then went on to subjugate those tribes and to win them over for a time. After this, there was a pause because of Zhang Wan's health issues, so for the next 3 years, effectively nothing happens. During that time, and Zhang Wan's withdrawal from active affairs, Zhang Wei's military role will increase. And then when Fei Yi becomes prime minister, Zhang Wei will be promoted again. And by this point, we're in the year 246, and for all practical intents and purposes, Zhang Wei is now commander-in-chief. A lot in the sources is made of the fact that Zhang Wei constantly needed to wrangle with critics of his policy. But remember, he mounted 11 total campaigns, or at least 10, if we discount the first one, which I am inclined to, where he was the paramount commander. And it is clear that he was consistently able to defeat his political foes at home and get this done. Supposedly, however, Fei Yi kept Zhang Wei on a kind of diet. And supposedly, Zhang Wei's invasions only had 10,000 men. But that must be an exaggeration because you can't really launch an invasion with only 10,000 men. At least in this period. And apparently Fei Yi was opposed to these campaigns because he told Zhang Wei that if Zhuge Liang wasn't able to succeed, why in the hell would anyone think that he could? Zhang Wei, however, felt that he could succeed where his mentor had failed because he had a lot of knowledge of this area as a native son of the Northwest. And so he felt that between his prior experience, his studies, and his local knowledge that he would be able to pull this off. That being said, his northern campaigns were not successful. During the second and third campaigns, he was defeated by Guo Huai and Xiahou Ba. And his claim is that the only reason he failed is because he didn't have enough men. There does seem to be a little bit to back that up. It does seem like he might have been under-resourced, even if it's probably not as severe as some accounts say. During the fourth expedition in 249, he did have more resources, and in this expedition his goal was to set up permanent fortresses in Liang province, but he wasn't able to do that because he was outflanked, and so feeling threatened, he decided to fall back. Now, while he was falling back, he decided to try to wheel around and gain surprise to inflict a defeat on the army pursuing him. But instead, that army was led by Deng Ai. And Deng Ai anticipated Zhang Wei would try that, and so when Zhang Wei made his thrust, he entered into thin air, because Deng Ai wasn't there. During the fifth expedition of 250, there was also a failure, and this was not noteworthy. We don't really know anything about it aside from the failure. In February of 253, a Wei civilian captured by Zhang Wei went back to Chengdu and was apparently allowed in polite society. But instead of, returning to civilian life or going home, he decided to try to murder the emperor, and once that proved to be a little bit too daunting, he instead murdered Fei Yi successfully. Weirdly enough, though, this was very beneficial for Zhang Wei, because Zhang Wei now had full authority to do what he wanted, because there was no more strong prime minister to hold him back. I'm not suggesting that this was some sort of Game of Thrones plot, but I do want to, raise the possibility a bit. But once again, we don't know as much as we'd like to because our sources are very limited. That same summer, 253, Zhang Wei's 6th expedition went out with a much larger force, but he was foiled by Sima Yi's eldest son, Sima Shi, and one of his flank forces got pushed in. He ran out of supplies, and he was forced to break a siege and run back home. But despite all that, in the next summer, the emperor gives him more authority. And with that extra authority, apparently, finally came success in the 7th expedition. So despite the fact that they lost Zhang Ni in battle, the Shu army will prevail. They will win a battle. They will slay the Wei commander Zhu Ji. And they will seize 3 whole commanderies. And then once they take those, they will kind of do a turtling strategy by doing population relocation. So they will take the men from those provinces and make them move elsewhere, and then move loyal subjects into these provinces. So they're slowly building themselves up north. This is probably Zhang Wei's best performance as a general, as right after the 7th expedition and the 8th expedition. So 7th was the biggest success, but I'd say he actually did better in the 8th, even if it is not as successful. And the reason for that is that he won multiple battles in this campaign. So there were multiple early battles, and he won 2 or 3 times against different columns, and he was laying siege to the city of Daidao. So he, up to this point, had been successful. This is the campaign where he and Liao Hua were butting heads. But then, Wei sent reinforcements. So Zhang Wei had effectively defeated the whole Wei army of the West, only to find out something that everybody had always known. Wei has superior resources. They can send more men. So you have to not only be able to beat them initially, but you have to keep beating them in order to get anything. So Wei will ultimately break the siege. That being said, Zhang Wei came pretty damn close to taking Daidao, and the commander there, Wang Jing, would say that they only had 10 days of food left when Zhang Wei retreated. So, in fairness to Zhang Wei, it is worth noting that Wei was simply superior. And so, for him to actually succeed would require near superhuman feats. And so, the 7th and 8th expeditions are him at his very, very best, where he is pretty close to succeeding at something that is impossible. The 9th expedition of 256 was a failure, but only because Dong Ai was back in command. And Dong Ai was vigilant, anticipated their moves, and he also knew what other officials didn't. That despite the fact that Shu should have been too exhausted to fight again, that Zhang Wei would try yet again to ride the momentum, because he had finally met with success after years of failure. So, that fails, and Zhang Wei actually had the numbers in this campaign, but in 3 separate engagements, he tried to gain Dong Ai's flank and failed. So it's kind of a little bit like the campaign where Sherman is fighting Johnston in 1864. Except Dong Ai, as Johnston, actually understood the concept of defense and won the battles, and then Zhang Wei Sherman had to retreat south. Now, one of the goals of that campaign, disappointingly for Zhang Wei, had been to recapture his hometown of Tianshui, so this might have stung pretty personally. But again, remember, Dong Ai makes Zhang Wei his bitch every time they fight. So this is just nature playing its course. Alright. In 257 to 58, the Wei general Zhuge Dan revolts. And Zhang Wei will try to capitalize, and he will try to attack along the Great Wall where he thinks there's an opening. So he marches far north and starts marching east. However, he brought a fairly small force because he's planning on taking advantage of surprise. But once again, he gets foiled by none other than Dong Ai. So Dong Ai will arrive, and now Zhang Wei will retreat. And by this point, Zhang Wei has lost a lot of public support. People are tired of these wasteful campaigns that cost so much money, that use up so much food, that get so many men killed, and they think of him as purely a warmonger. And in fact, there are satirical poems in circulation in the capital making fun of him. Liao Hua, who had long been Zhang Wei's general, now joined in the chorus of critics and said that Zhang Wei persisted in hammering away at an enemy superior to him in power and intelligence. So effectively, he's just saying that Zhang Wei is mindless and just keeps attacking. The final expedition, however, would still occur, and that occurs in 262, the 11th expedition. This time, Zhang Wei, rather than going for a specific objective, decides to take out Dong Ai. So he goes directly after Dong Ai's army and gets defeated. And then the following year, Dong Ai and Zhang Hui will now attack Shu. And of course, as we mentioned, Zhang Hui will tie up the main force of Shu, and then Dong Ai will will break contact, go off the main roads, and arrive at Chengdu. So in many ways, what I've made the case for is Dong Ai being a monster of a general, and Zhang Wei being severely outmatched, just outclassed entirely. So imagine someone who's a relatively competent commander facing a military genius and just getting trounced over and over and over and over and over, because that's what happened with Zhang Wei and Dong Ai. Now, we already mentioned that Zhang Wei was always aggressive, and so when Zhang Hui was planning to do a coup because he was jealous of the influence of Dong Ai, and also was not a big fan of Sima Zhao, who was taking over the Wei government, of course, Zhang Wei said, "Fuck yes, Zhang Hui, we should revolt. I'll get the men loyal to Shu to join you, and we'll go take over the government back in Luoyang." But Zhang Wei's support was not nearly enough to make the difference, and he ended up dying as a rebel. In terms of how to assess the man, first of all, he's usually portrayed in almost every form of media as a very young man because of the age he was when he entered service. But it's kind of like the Huang Zhang issue, where we think of him as a certain age because that's where he appears in the story. But, in fact, Zhang Wei, by the time that he dies, will be in his 60s. And again, that's an unusually old age for someone in this period. So Zhang Wei was at least 62 years old when he died, meaning older than most people live to be. Another thing about him is that we try to assess his generalship, and it's a little tough, because I think that he's right on the level that you can't just simply sit pat and allow Wei to get stronger and stronger and stronger. You have to do something. You have to try to upset the apple cart to change the math in some way. So the Northern Expeditions actually make sense. But his campaigns were not that imaginative. It doesn't appear that he ever really tried anything all that new or interesting. He doesn't seem to have perfected Zhang Wan's idea of using the rivers. He also doesn't really seem to have managed to get the slip on his enemies. Now, he did try several times, but it seems like he was always anticipated. And whether that's because his ideas were too predictable, or whether it's because there was a leak in his camp, I don't know. But at any rate, he was never really able to do anything when faced with a guy like Dong Ai. And so, over the course of his career, while he does have one campaign where he wins, and another campaign where he is on the path to victory at first, I think it's safe to say that on every campaign, for the most part, he's pretty consistently outgeneraled. And to be fair, the guys he's facing are pretty major figures like Guo Huai and then Dong Ai. So he's not facing scrubs, but still, of his 11 expeditions, only one saw territorial gains. And only 2 of them had actual victories. So I can't help but feel that Zhang Wei is not a very good general. and he was promoted way beyond his ability. I hate to say it, but he's the Luigi Cadorna of Shu Han. He mounts way too many of the same attack, and I will put him above Luigi Cadorna, though, because although he is a butcher, he is a little more imaginative. He does try other routes of invasion, and he also will have at least a few successes, but overall he has some Cadorna-esque qualities. That being said, again, because there is a necessity to do something, whereas Luigi Cadorna had full authority to do whatever he wanted and still mounted foolish attacks, I will put Zhang Wei in the E category rather than F. He's bad, but I can kind of feel some sympathy for him because he did have to do something, and he was commanding an inferior army in terms of resources. And the fact that he came close a couple of times to winning shows me that he's not completely incompetent. He was just massively outmatched by Deng Ai. Alright, let's check the stream. We're getting close now. Alright. Now, let's get to Xiahou Ba. As you might recognize from the name, he is someone who comes from one of the key families in Wei. His father was Xiahou Yuan, the guy who died at Mount Dingjun, and Xiahou Ba would take his place and be a prominent figure on the western frontier for many years. Xiahou Ba, in fact, spent his entire career in the west, and he was frequently an opponent of Shu. In fact, in many of the campaigns fought in the west, including many of Zhang Wei's northern expeditions, Xiahou Ba was usually about the second-ranking guy in the Wei army. He served loyally until the late 240s, but then Sima Yi executed Cao Shuang. And Xiahou Ba feared that Sima Yi was moving against the Cao family and the Xiahou family, because these two were very closely related and had been governing Wei together. And so Xiahou Ba started to try to figure out ways to make it out. He also was deeply offended when Sima Yi promoted his personal enemy Guo Huai to replace his cousin Xiahou Zhuan. And so that insult was enough, and his concerns for his safety, to lead him to defect to Shu. Now, when he left, he apparently tried and failed to persuade his cousin and his sons to go with him, and they refused, so he traveled by himself. And in many ways, this is a lot like Ma Chao's defection in that it really fucked over his family. It also was a very fraught escape. So he nearly died when he fell from a horse, took a really nasty fall, and then he nearly died of exposure before someone found him with the horse on top of him and saved him. But when he did finally get to Shu, he actually met with a very warm reception. And that's because, believe it or not, he was related to Liu Shan. And that's because Zhang Fei, around 200 or so, had actually abducted one of Xiahou Yuan's teenage cousins and married her. So the mother of Zhang Fei's children, including General Zhang Bao, I believe, was a cousin to Xiahou Ba. And so that union between Zhang Fei and his abducted bride produced Liu Shan's wife. So Zhang Fei, of course, produced two daughters. Liu Shan married both of them. And so when Xiahou Ba arrives, he's greeted as a kinsman. And Liu Shan immediately invites him to dine. And so he becomes buddy-buddy with the emperor a little bit. He's greeted as a kind of imperial uncle. And he also will be embraced warmly by Zhang Wei, who very much respects what Xiahou Ba has accomplished on the battlefield and is really eager to put him to work. That being said, despite this warm reception and despite playing it up for propaganda that they got a Xiahou on their side, we have to remember Xiahou Ba by this time is old. He's about 60, maybe as old as 70 by the time that he comes over.
and he will immediately get a senior command and be put in the field. And there will be some distrust for him. That being said, he'll get along well with Zhang Ni and with Zhang Wei. And so he's going to be put in a very senior position early. He also technically will end up with a civilian rank higher than Zhang Wei's. And that's probably just because of his kinship with the dynasty. But militarily, Zhang Wei will still be commander-in-chief. So Xiahou upon his arrival, immediately gets a senior command when one of the other senior generals dies. When Zhang Wei starts reviving the northern campaigns, part of that is because Xiahou assured him that after the coup, Sima Yi and his sons will be more tied up with internal security for years than they will be with attacking Shu or Wu. So the time was ripe, according to Xiahou. So Xiahou, in many ways, is the driver of these renewed campaigns. In 255, Xiahou and Zhang Yi will serve as Zhang Wei's chief lieutenants at Daidao. This is the follow-up to the victory where Zhang Ni dies. And here, there will be another victory for Xiahou. And again, they came a mere 10 days away from receiving the surrender of a major city before Chen Tai and Deng Ai arrived and messed things up for them. But between the Battle of Daidao in 255 and 259, we don't hear anything about Xiahou. And it appears that he must have passed away quietly because of his age. Xiahou provided a lot of insight that Shu was not really able to do that much with, except for planning the one campaign where they won a couple victories before, Wei's resources won out. He did pretty well in a short period of time, but again, it was a very abbreviated service because of his old age. I'm not going to rank him based on the damage he did to his family, because that's more of a Wei problem. That being said, what he did was not enough to really alter anything at the end of the day. And so for me, while I'm sure this was a huge news event at the time, it really didn't move the needle. And so for me, Xiahou is a C. We could also say he's the reason why Zhang Wei is not an F. I think that would be an accurate statement, because he helped Zhang Wei win the one or two battles he actually won. Next up we have Huang Hao, the court eunuch who becomes good friends with Liu Shan. So Huang Hao was influential, but not terribly well liked in Shu Han, except by the one man whose opinion really mattered, the emperor, Liu Shan. He may well have actually been a competent administrator, and as a eunuch, this means he would have been smeared reflexively, because again, if you're a eunuch, you're immediately called degenerate, you're called corrupt, and you're called untrustworthy and scheming. So no matter what you do or who you actually are, those stock accusations will attach if you have any kind of power or influence at the expense of any kind of land-owning aristocrat. Now, we know for a fact that Dong Yun will not be a big fan of Huang Hao and will very much hold him back during his lifetime. He also will express a lot of warnings against allowing Huang Hao to have power. He'll express these to everyone who would listen, including the emperor. And he said that Huang Hao was sycophantic and an empty robe, whose only interest was self-promotion. But after Dong Yun dies, Chen Ji becomes the head of government, and he is a strong ally to Huang Hao. But then Chen Ji dies in 258, and now Huang Hao, in many ways, will be heading the Shu Han state, at least until that final crisis where Zhuge Zhan steps up, who is the son of Zhuge Liang. So, one of Huang Hao's accomplishments, apparently, is that he was known for causing drama. So, for instance, he will help to drive a wedge between Liu Shan and his younger brother Liu Yang, as they despise each other, and this will get worse because of Huang Hao's dealings. The two of them will not speak for a decade, so the Emperor Liu Shan will be increasingly isolated from others due to Huang Hao, At least that's what the sources say. I don't know whether he was involved or that involved in this sort of family feud. It's hard to say. There were also a number of other senior officials who refused to work with Huang Hao at all. And it's clear that he was not nearly as vicious as the court eunuchs of the late Han, as the efforts that he made against his enemies were pretty limited. So even though we know that he has a lot of enemies, he won't really go after them or try to advise the emperor to kill them. So his best known contribution, which is a negative one in this case, is that he has a feud with Zhang Wei, and he tells Liu Shan to disregard Zhang Wei's warning about a massive attack coming in 263. He says that Zhang Wei is simply a warmonger, and that he's not to be trusted. And so, Shu's not properly prepared because Liu Shan ignores the warnings. So while Zhang Wei will do his part and block part of the invasion, the government at Chengdu will have to form an ad hoc army under Zhuge Zhan, which will not be enough to stop Deng Ai. And apparently this advice was backed up by astrology. So Huang Hao justified his prediction because he said that he read his horoscope. Now, in Huang Hao's defense, Zhang Wei was a warmonger, and Zhang Wei was not very successful. And he also had a lot of detractors and skeptics, including Zhuge Zhan, who actually, despite the fact that Zhang Wei was a protege of his father, Zhuge Zhan apparently was very critical of Zhang Wei and said that he really wasn't a very good student of Zhuge Liang. Anyway, we're ranking Huang Hao here, and while I want to make a case that he's probably not as bad as he's portrayed, he's probably still pretty bad. I'm actually going to go ahead and put him in F. Because if he is responsible for that last piece of advice to not prepare for the 263 campaign, then he really screwed over Shu Han. So it's not just an opportunity missed. This is a kingdom destroyed. And so he gets a slot next to Ma Chao. Next up, we have the aforementioned Zhuge Zhan. So he's Zhuge Liang's son. He's born pretty late in Zhuge Liang's life, only in 227. And so he was still pretty young when his dad died in 234. There's an apocryphal account of his life that says that Zhuge Liang wrote to his older brother in Wu and said that he was very proud of his son's charm and precociousness, but said that he thought his son would ultimately kind of fall short intellectually. But again, this strikes me as Zhuge Liang glazing. Because again, he's often sort of given this reputation for superhuman foresight, and yet somehow that never produced victories. So there's no way you could look at like a 7-year-old kid and make that kind of a prediction. And also, it's just amazing how much even Shu sources will smash Shu officers to build up Zhuge Liang's reputation for genius. Not to mention, Zhuge Liang's final years were very busy. He's running the civilian government and the armies, and fighting in the north all the time, so I doubt he's spending that much time with his kid. So he probably doesn't really know shit about his son. Now, because there was so much mourning for the departed Zhuge Liang, this means that Zhuge Zhan was celebrated just for existing. And so, anytime the government did something smart, a lot of people simply assumed it was Zhuge Zhan's doing. And so this man is actually very popular. So he's kind of like JFK Jr. back when he was still alive. Someone who was very much looked upon as being way more than he was simply because of his name and because of that sort of yearning for the father. That being said, Zhuge Zhan was a fairly skilled guy. He was a good calligrapher and painter. He had a great memory. And so at the age of 16, he is rewarded by marrying one of Liu Shan's daughters. And thus the two most famous names in the Shu kingdom are now united, as the Zhuge family and the Liu family have now become one. And so in theory, if Shu Han had continued longer, there would have been an emperor with Zhuge Liang's DNA. But of course we know that doesn't happen. Zhuge Liang will serve in the army as a young man and continue to rise through the ranks from there. He actually will start out with the cavalry, so apparently he's a little bit more of a physical specimen than his dad had been. And in war policy, he actually finds himself butting heads with Zhang Wei, as I mentioned earlier. He actually thought that his dad had terrible policies. When he looks back and studies them, he thought that his dad had a horrible idea in 233-4, and he also felt like Zhang Wei's 11 northern campaigns were hopeless. Now, it's unclear if this meant a personal problem between the two or if they were just rivals. But most likely they did sort of fight over the legacy of Zhuge Liang, with Zhang Wei claiming, "I knew the man, and I know what he wanted," whereas Zhuge Zhan is simply saying, maybe my father wasn't actually that smart. Either that or maybe you're just misappropriating his legacy. So there is probably a personal bitterness here, because they are fighting over the legacy of someone who is central to the identities of each of them in different ways. We do know for a fact Zhuge Zhan writes to Liu Shan and actually says Zhang Wei should be removed in favor of a general who was an ally of Huang Hao. But despite the fact that this was a way that could have appealed to Liu Shan, who loved Huang Hao, he decides instead to not act once again. So despite the fact that Liu Shan loved Double Z and also Huang Hao, he decides that Zhang Wei will remain commander-in-chief of the army. There's a pretty good chance, of course, that Zhuge Zhan actually was eyeing Zhang Wei's office, despite the fact that he was relatively young and inexperienced, and that he was simply employing false humility, which I imagine is a very common and successful tactic in Shu, where they have this building mythology of these really humble founders. But at any rate, Zhuge Zhan will not get the nod to be commander-in-chief. It's also possible, though, that this was more purely personal and that their disagreements were not that substantive, because we do have to note that there's a major policy decision by Zhang Wei to dismantle the old defenses set up by Wei Yan, which have been successful for a long time, and that Zhuge Zhan, despite saying Zhang Wei was wrong about everything, didn't say a peep about that. So when it comes to specifics, it appears that Zhuge Zhan was sometimes a little bit reluctant to offer up details. Now, this means that when they mobilize finally in 263, after having ignored Zhang Wei's warnings, that Zhuge Zhan will be in command of the reserve forces at Chengdu. With Zhang Wei tied up fighting Zhang Hui, this means that Zhuge Zhan will be the man forced to try to fight Deng Ai. The problem is Zhuge Zhan and his officers are mostly inexperienced aristocrats and locals who are just called up. So the actual army is all of Zhang Wei. And so they have to try to make a stand, and they fail terribly. One of the generals actually made a bold suggestion of just doing a forced march to try to seize some mountainous terrain ahead of the Wei army and hold that, but Zhuge Zhan said no, we must instead defend the fortified city of Mianzhu. It's unclear if this decision was wise or not, but given that he did put up a stiff resistance, maybe he did make the right call. And just as in the novel, the historical army of Zhuge Zhan had a lot of famous sons and grandsons of people who actually mattered. So there are sons of Zhao Yun. Zhuge Zhan has his own son, who's therefore a grandson of Zhuge Liang. There is Zhang Fei's grandson. A lot of people. Huang Quan's son. So it's a literal gathering of the who's who of Shu. Next Generation. Dinner Party edition. And yet, it turns out that you cannot inherit military abilities because these men will all fail. Zhuge Zhan seems to have really resolved the fight and engendered an atmosphere of not allowing for surrender. And that's partly because Dong Ai actually gives him a chance to surrender, and then Zhuge Zhan will violate norms by killing the messenger. He will eventually fail. He's going to be annihilated, and with him he will get killed a large number of the noblemen of Shu. And then after his failure, that's when Liu Shan will throw in the towel. It's also not entirely clear that Dong Ai had an overwhelming, insurmountable advantage in numbers. Because although in quality he certainly did have an advantage, the fortified centers were all with Zhuge Zhan. Zhuge Zhan also had supplies. And so, most likely, this was just another example of someone with almost no experience fighting a brilliant general in Dong Ai and predictably getting completely annihilated. Rating Zhuge Zhan is a bit difficult because he does fail pretty badly. At the same time, he does seem to have had some sense. I can't go with an F, but I think an E seems appropriate. So he can go next to his rival, Zhang Wei. Next up, we have Zhuge Shang, who is Zhuge Zhan's son, Zhuge Liang's grandson, and the last of a proud line of Shu officers. When Dong Ai invades in the early 260s, he's still a young man, probably still in his teens, so late teens, still an adult, but barely, and he will fight at Mianzhu. In fiction, of course, he's noted for his eagerness to lead the army's vanguard, whereas in history, he simply bemoans his father's failure to oppose Huang Hao and his policies. So he was a Zhuge, so he's already very informed and opinionated. And in fiction, he was known for his willingness to go out and lead the vanguard. This doesn't really appear to happen, but he does fight and die in the battle. He's not really that notable, but he does get some attention because of his last name. That being said, I'm willing to grant him a C, simply because for the very, very limited responsibilities that he did them adequately. He pointed out some obvious flaws that probably were fairly well known, or at least an opinion that was pretty popular, and then he fought and died in a battle where that was all he could do. And finally, we have the second son of Zhao Yun, named Zhao Guang. So his older brother was named Zhao Tong. The two of them will enter Shu Han's service. In the novel, they're portrayed mostly as civilians, and they're only really seen when they are telling Liu Shan that their father has passed away. And then the three of them kind of embrace and cry it out. But in reality, both Zhao brothers were soldiers. That being said, I didn't cover Zhao Tong because there's not much information, but Zhao Guang, of the two, took the family business more seriously, or at least he lived longer and was able to contribute more. So it seems like Zhao Tong followed out of duty, whereas Zhao Guang actually was very dedicated to his craft. So in 263, Zhao Guang was serving in Zhang Wei's army, and at some point in the campaign he fell and was killed. Some accounts saying he died early, and others saying that he only died fighting at Chengdu, although that's of course a contradiction given that Zhang Wei's army was never near Chengdu. So again, because of the minimalism of sources, we don't really know that much, and because the fall of Shu Han was very depressing for the sources, they don't go into a lot of details. It's hard to rank Zhao Guang, and if there was a U category, that's where he'd go. But I'm actually going to go ahead and rank him because fuck it, I didn't put a U category. And so I'm going to give him a C. Because it seems like he did what he's supposed to. It's just, we don't even know what he's supposed to do, but I guess he did it, maybe. I'm sleepy, if you can't tell. So anyway, these are my rankings of the Shu Han generals. Interesting bunch. I would say not particularly talented. although there are obviously some very talented men among them. I would say overall that the other two kingdoms actually have more interesting officer corps, but Shu Han's are still pretty intriguing, and I think a lot of the intrigue is just because of the propaganda surrounding them, though. So anyway, that's all I have to say on this topic, and at some point in the future, when I've had the time, I will certainly come back and look at the generals of Eastern Wu and of Cao Wei. Later in the month, I also will be looking at Xbox 360 games, because Xbox 360's online services, or at least the online store, will be formally closing, I believe, on July 29th. So I'd like to do a stream ahead of that to commemorate what is now a historical video game platform that's nearly 20 years old and is still kind of active in 2024. So I think that's kind of cool, worth remembering. Next week, most likely, Sean and I will do a stream on the Overland campaign. So we'll be pushing back to Tokyo Trials. In terms of what I'm working on my own, I was delayed tonight by about 10 minutes because I tried and failed to use a mic arm that I ordered. And apparently that will give me better audio if I can figure out how to use the damn thing. But literally, it is something I don't understand at all. So mic arms are frankly beyond my technical abilities. And so I will need to get a different mic arm, because the one I bought would require me to drill and do some other shit I really don't have the ability to do. So I need one with a vise on it so I can actually attach it to something without having to make a fucking mess that I don't really know how to clean up. So yeah. Anyway, so I'll probably put out at least one video before the week's over, and most likely the subject of that will be Gaius Antonius Hybrida, the so-called half-beast, one of the most notorious Romans of the late Republic, an uncle to Mark Antony. We have one super chat tonight from Michael R. for $2. Thank you, Michael. He says, thanks for helping me get through my night shift. Well, I'm glad that you showed up, Michael, and thank you to everyone else who showed up as well. All right. Well, that's all I have. My throat is sore. I guess this is why I quit doing these solo streams, because it is very taxing on the throat. All right. Well, that's all I have for now. So I'm just going to awkwardly end this before I ramble on. So good night, everybody. Thank you for joining me. And I will see you in this format next week when Sean and I return to talk about the Overland campaign. So good night, good luck, and follow your dreams.